Number 34 and number 27. Dante passed through all the stages of torture natural to prisoners in suspense. He was sustained at first by that pride of conscious innocence which is the sequence to hope. Then he began to doubt his own innocence, which justified in some measure the governor's belief in his mental alienation. And then, relaxing his sentiment of pride, he addressed his supplications not to God, but to man. God is always the last resource. Unfortunates, who ought to begin with God, do not have any hope in him till they have exhausted all other means of deliverance. Dante asked to be removed from his present dungeon into another, for a change, however disadvantageous, was still a change, and would afford him some amusement. He entreated to be allowed to walk about, to have fresh air, books, and writing materials. His requests were not granted, but he went on asking all the same. He accustomed himself to speaking to the new jailer, although the latter was, if possible, more taciturn than the old one. But still, to speak to a man, even though mute, was something. Dante spoke for the sake of hearing his own voice. He had tried to speak when alone, but the sound of his voice terrified him. Often before his captivity, Dante's mind had revolted at the idea of assemblages of prisoners, made up of thieves, vagabonds, and murderers. He now wished to be amongst them, in order to see some other face besides that of his jailer. He sighed for the galleys, with the infamous costume, the chain, and the brand on the shoulder. The galley slaves breathed the fresh air of heaven and saw each other. They were very happy. He besought the jailer one day to let him have a companion, were it even the mad abbé. The jailer, though rough and hardened by the constant sight of so much suffering, was yet a man. At the bottom of his heart he had often had a feeling of pity for this unhappy young man who suffered so, and he laid the request of number 34 before the governor. But the latter sapiently imagined that Dante wished to conspire or attempt an escape, and refused his request. Dante had exhausted all human resources, and he then turned to God. All the pious ideas that had been so long forgotten returned. He recollected the prayers his mother had taught him, and discovered a new meaning in every word. For in prosperity prayers seem but a mere medley of words, until misfortune comes, and the unhappy sufferer first understands the meaning of the sublime language in which he invokes the pity of heaven. He prayed and prayed aloud, no longer terrified at the sound of his own voice, for he fell into a sort of ecstasy. He laid every action of his life before the Almighty, proposed tasks to accomplish, and at the end of every prayer introduced the entreaty oftener addressed to man than to God, "Forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive them that trespass against us." Yet, in spite of his earnest prayers, Dante remained a prisoner. Then gloom settled heavily upon him. Dante was a man of great simplicity of thought, and without education. He could not, therefore, in the solitude of his dungeon, traverse in mental vision the history of the ages, bring to life the nations that had perished, and rebuild the ancient cities, so vast and stupendous in the light of the imagination, and that pass before the eye, glowing with celestial colors, in Martin's Babylonian pictures. He could not do this, he whose past life was so short, whose present so melancholy, and his future so doubtful. 19 years of light to reflect upon in eternal darkness. No distraction could come to his aid. His energetic spirit, that would have exulted in thus revisiting the past, was imprisoned like an eagle in a cage. He clung to one idea, that of his happiness destroyed without apparent cause by an unheard-of fatality. He considered and reconsidered this idea, devoured it, so to speak, as the implacable Ugolino devours the skull of Archbishop Roger in the Inferno of Dante. Rage supplanted religious fervor. Dante uttered blasphemies that made his jailer recoil with horror, dashed himself furiously against the walls of his prison, wreaked his anger upon everything, and chiefly upon himself, so that the least thing, a grain of sand, a straw, or a breath of air that annoyed him, led to paroxysms of fury. Then the letter that Villefort had showed to him recurred to his mind, and every line gleamed forth in fiery letters on the wall like the Mene Tekel Upharsin of Belshazzar. He told himself that it was the enmity of man, and not the vengeance of heaven, that had thus plunged him into the deepest misery. He consigned his unknown persecutors to the most horrible tortures he could imagine, and found them all insufficient, because after torture came death, and after death, if not repose, at least the boon of unconsciousness. By dint of constantly dwelling on the idea that tranquillity was death, and if punishment were the end in view, other tortures than death must be invented, he began to reflect on suicide. Unhappy he who, on the brink of misfortune, broods over ideas like these. Before him is a dead sea that stretches in azure calm before the eye. But he who unwarily ventures within its embrace finds himself struggling with a monster that would drag him down to perdition. Once thus ensnared, unless the protecting hand of God snatch him thence, all is over, and his struggles but tend to hasten his destruction. This state of mental anguish is, however, less terrible than the sufferings that precede or the punishment that possibly will follow. There is a sort of consolation at the contemplation of the yawning abyss, at the bottom of which lie darkness and obscurity. Edmond found some solace in these ideas. All his sorrows, all his sufferings, with their train of gloomy specters, fled from his cell when the angel of death seemed about to enter. Dante reviewed his past life with composure, and, looking forward with terror to his future existence, chose that middle line that seemed to afford him a refuge. "Sometimes," said he, "in my voyages, when I was a man and commanded other men, I have seen the heavens overcast, the sea rage and foam, the storm arise, and like a monstrous bird, beating the two horizons with its wings. Then I felt that my vessel was a vain refuge that trembled and shook before the tempest. Soon the fury of the waves and the sight of the sharp rocks announced the approach of death, and death then terrified me, and I used all my skill and intelligence as a man and a sailor to struggle against the wrath of God. But I did so because I was happy, because I had not courted death, because to be cast upon a bed of rocks and seaweed seemed terrible, because I was unwilling that I, a creature made for the service of God, should serve for food to the gulls and ravens. But now it is different. I have lost all that bound me to life. Death smiles and invites me to repose. I die after my own manner. I die exhausted and broken-spirited, as I fall asleep when I have paced 3,000 times round my cell." No sooner had this idea taken possession of him than he became more composed, arranged his couch to the best of his power, ate little and slept less, and found existence almost supportable, because he felt that he could throw it off at pleasure like a worn-out garment. Two methods of self-destruction were at his disposal. He could hang himself with his handkerchief to the window bars, or refuse food and die of starvation. But the first was repugnant to him. Dante has always entertained the greatest horror of pirates who are hung up to the yardarm. He would not die by what seemed an infamous death. He resolved to adopt the second, and began that day to carry out his resolve. Nearly 4 years had passed away. At the end of the second he had ceased to mark the lapse of time. Dante said, "I wish to die," and had chosen the manner of his death, and fearful of changing his mind, he had taken an oath to die. "When my morning and evening meals are brought," thought he, "I will cast them out of the window, and they will think that I have eaten them." He kept his word. Twice a day he cast out, through the barred aperture, the provisions his jailer brought him, at first gaily, then with deliberation, and at last with regret. Nothing but the recollection of his oath gave him strength to proceed. Hunger made viands once repugnant, now acceptable. He held the plate in his hand for an hour at a time, and gazed thoughtfully at the morsel of bad meat, of tainted fish, of black and mouldy bread. It was the last yearning for life, contending with the resolution of despair. Then his dungeon seemed less somber, his prospects less desperate. He was still young. He was only 4 or 5 and 20. He had nearly 50 years to live. What unforeseen events might not open his prison door and restore him to liberty? Then he raised to his lips the repast that, like a voluntary Tantalus, he refused himself, but he thought of his oath, and he would not break it. He persisted until at last he had not sufficient strength to rise and cast his supper out of the loophole. The next morning he could not see or hear. The jailer feared he was dangerously ill. Edmond hoped he was dying. Thus the day passed away. Edmond felt a sort of stupor creeping over him, which brought with it a feeling almost of content. The gnawing pain at his stomach had ceased. His thirst had abated. When he closed his eyes he saw myriads of lights dancing before them like the will-o'-the-wisps that play about the marshes. It was the twilight of that mysterious country called death. Suddenly, about 9 o'clock in the evening, Edmond heard a hollow sound in the wall against which he was lying. So many loathsome animals inhabited the prison that their noise did not, in general, awake him. But whether abstinence had quickened his faculties, or whether the noise was really louder than usual, Edmond raised his head and listened. It was a continual scratching, as if made by a huge claw, a powerful tooth, or some iron instrument attacking the stones. Although weakened, the young man's brain instantly responded to the idea that haunts all prisoners: liberty. It seemed to him that heaven had at length taken pity on him, and had sent this noise to warn him on the very brink of the abyss. Perhaps one of those beloved ones he had so often thought of was thinking of him, and striving to diminish the distance that separated them. No, no, doubtless he was deceived, and it was but one of those dreams that forerun death. Edmund still heard the sound. It lasted nearly 3 hours. He then heard a noise of something falling, and all was silent. Some hours afterwards it began again, nearer and more distinct. Edmund was intensely interested. Suddenly the jailer entered. For a week since he had resolved to die, and during the 4 days that he had been carrying out his purpose, Edmund had not spoken to the attendant, had not answered him when he inquired what was the matter with him, and turned his face to the wall when he looked too curiously at him. But now the jailer might hear the noise and put an end to it, and so destroy a ray of something like hope that soothed his last moments. The jailer brought him his breakfast. Dante raised himself up and began to talk about everything, about the bad quality of the food, about the coldness of his dungeon, grumbling and complaining in order to have an excuse for speaking louder, and wearying the patience of his jailer, who out of kindness of heart had brought broth and white bread for his prisoner. Fortunately, he fancied that Dante was delirious, and placing the food on the rickety table he withdrew. Edmund listened, and the sound became more and more distinct. "There can be no doubt about it," thought he. "It is some prisoner who is striving to obtain his freedom. Oh, if I were only there to help him!" Suddenly another idea took possession of his mind, so used to misfortune that it was scarcely capable of hope: the idea that the noise was made by workmen the governor had ordered to repair the neighboring dungeon. It was easy to ascertain this, but how could he risk the question? It was easy to call his jailer's attention to the noise, and watch his countenance as he listened, but might he not by this means destroy hopes far more important than the short-lived satisfaction of his own curiosity? Unfortunately, Edmund's brain was still so feeble that he could not bend his thoughts to anything in particular. He saw but one means of restoring lucidity and clearness to his judgment. He turned his eyes towards the soup which the jailer had brought, rose, staggered towards it, raised the vessel to his lips, and drank off the contents with a feeling of indescribable pleasure. He had often heard that shipwrecked persons had died through having eagerly devoured too much food. Edmund replaced on the table the bread he was about to devour, and returned to his couch. He did not wish to die. He soon felt that his ideas became again collected. He could think, and strengthen his thoughts by reasoning. Then he said to himself, I must put this to the test, but without compromising anybody. If it is a workman, I need but knock against the wall, and he will cease to work, in order to find out who is knocking and why he does so. But as his occupation is sanctioned by the governor, he will soon resume it. If, on the contrary, it is a prisoner, the noise I make will alarm him. He will cease, and not begin again until he thinks every one is asleep." Edmond rose again, but this time his legs did not tremble, and his sight was clear. He went to a corner of his dungeon, detached a stone, and with it knocked against the wall where the sound came. He struck thrice. At the first blow the sound ceased, as if by magic. Edmond listened intently. An hour passed, 2 hours passed, and no sound was heard from the wall. All was silent there. Full of hope, Edmond swallowed a few mouthfuls of bread and water, and, thanks to the vigor of his constitution, found himself well nigh recovered. The day passed away in utter silence. Night came without recurrence of the noise. "It is a prisoner," said Edmond joyfully. The night passed in perfect silence. Edmond did not close his eyes. In the morning the jailer brought him fresh provisions. He had already devoured those of the previous day. He ate these, listening anxiously for the sound, walking round and round his cell, shaking the iron bars of the loophole, restoring vigor and agility to his limbs by exercise, and so preparing himself for his future destiny. At intervals he listened to learn if the noise had not begun again, and grew impatient at the prudence of the prisoner, who did not guess he had been disturbed by a captive as anxious for liberty as himself. 3 days passed, 72 long, tedious hours, which he counted off by minutes. At length, one evening, as the jailer was visiting him for the last time that night, Dante, with his ear for the 100th time at the wall, fancied he heard an almost imperceptible movement among the stones. He moved away, walked up and down his cell to collect his thoughts, and then went back and listened. The matter was no longer doubtful. Something was at work on the other side of the wall. The prisoner had discovered the danger, and had substituted a lever for a chisel. Encouraged by this discovery, Edmond determined to assist the indefatigable laborer. He began by moving his bed, and looked around for anything with which he could pierce the wall, penetrate the moist cement, and displace a stone. He saw nothing. He had no knife or sharp instrument. The window grating was of iron, but he had too often assured himself of its solidity. All his furniture consisted of a bed, a chair, a table, a pail, and a jug. The bed had iron clamps, but they were screwed to the wood, and it would have required a screwdriver to take them off. The table and chair had nothing. The pail had once possessed a handle, but that had been removed. Dante had but one resource, which was to break the jug, and with one of the sharp fragments attack the wall. He let the jug fall on the floor, and it broke in pieces. Dante concealed 2 or 3 of the sharpest fragments in his bed, leaving the rest on the floor. The breaking of his jug was too natural an accident to excite suspicion. Edmond had all the night to work in, but in the darkness he could not do much, and he soon felt that he was working against something very hard. He pushed back his bed and waited for day. All night he heard the subterranean workmen, who continued to mine his way. Day came. The jailer entered. Dante told him that the jug had fallen from his hands while he was drinking, and the jailer went grumblingly to fetch another, without giving himself the trouble to remove the fragments of the broken one. He returned speedily, advised the prisoner to be more careful, and departed. Dante heard joyfully the key grate in the lock. He listened until the sound of steps died away, and then, hastily displacing his bed, saw by the faint light that penetrated into his cell that he had labored uselessly the previous evening in attacking the stone instead of removing the plaster that surrounded it. The damp had rendered it friable, and Dante was able to break it off, in small morsels, it is true, but at the end of half an hour he had scraped off a handful. A mathematician might have calculated that in 2 years, supposing that the rock was not encountered, a passage 20 feet long and 2 feet broad might be formed. The prisoner reproached himself with not having thus employed the hours he had passed in vain hopes, prayer, and despondency. During the 6 years that he had been imprisoned, what might he not have accomplished? In 3 days he had succeeded, with the utmost precaution, in removing the cement and exposing the stonework. The wall was built of rough stones, among which, to give strength to the structure, blocks of hewn stone were at intervals embedded. It was one of these he had uncovered, and which he must remove from its socket. Dante strove to do this with his nails, but they were too weak. The fragments of the jug broke, and after an hour of useless toil he paused. Was he to be thus stopped at the beginning, and was he to wait inactive until his fellow workman had completed his task? Suddenly an idea occurred to him. He smiled, and the perspiration dried on his forehead. The jailer always brought Dante's soup in an iron saucepan. This saucepan contained soup for both prisoners, for Dante had noticed that it was either quite full or half empty, according as the turnkey gave it to him or to his companion first. The handle of the saucepan was of iron. Dante would have given 10 years of his life in exchange for it. The jailer was accustomed to pour the contents of the saucepan into Dante's plate, and Dante, after eating his soup with a wooden spoon, washed the plate, which thus served for every day. Now, when evening came, Dante put his plate on the ground near the door. The jailer, as he entered, stepped on it and broke it. This time he could not blame Dante. He was wrong to leave it there, but the jailer was wrong not to have looked before him. The jailer therefore only grumbled. Then he looked about for something to pour the soup into. Dante's entire dinner service consisted of one plate. There was no alternative. "Leave the saucepan," said Dante. "You can take it away when you bring me my breakfast." This advice was to the jailer's taste, as it spared him the necessity of making another trip. He left the saucepan. Dante was beside himself with joy. He rapidly devoured his food, and after waiting an hour, lest the jailer should change his mind and return, he removed his bed, took the handle of the saucepan, inserted the point between the hewn stone and rough stones of the wall, and employed it as a lever. A slight oscillation showed Dante that all went well. At the end of an hour the stone was extricated from the wall, leaving a cavity 1.5 feet in diameter. Dante carefully collected the plaster, carried it into the corner of his cell, and covered it with earth. Then, wishing to make the best use of his time while he had the means of labor, he continued to work without ceasing. At the dawn of day he replaced the stone, pushed his bed against the wall, and lay down. The breakfast consisted of a piece of bread. The jailer entered and placed the bread on the table. "Well, don't you intend to bring me another plate?" said Dante. "No," replied the turnkey. "You destroy everything. First you break your jug, then you make me break your plate. If all the prisoners followed your example, the government would be ruined. I shall leave you the saucepan, and pour your soup into that. So for the future, I hope you will not be so destructive." Dante raised his eyes to heaven and clasped his hands beneath the coverlet. He felt more gratitude for the possession of this piece of iron than he had ever felt for anything. He had noticed, however, that the prisoner on the other side had ceased to labor. No matter, this was a greater reason for proceeding. If his neighbor would not come to him, he would go to his neighbor. All day he toiled on untiringly, and by the evening he had succeeded in extracting 10 handfuls of plaster and fragments of stone. When the hour for his jailer's visit arrived, Dante straightened the handle of the saucepan as well as he could, and placed it in its accustomed place. The turnkey poured his ration of soup into it, together with the fish, for thrice a week the prisoners were deprived of meat. This would have been a method of reckoning time, had not Dante long ceased to do so. Having poured out the soup, the turnkey retired. Dante wished to ascertain whether his neighbor had really ceased to work. He listened. All was silent, as it had been for the last 3 days. Dante sighed. It was evident that his neighbor distrusted him. However, he toiled on all the night without being discouraged, but after 2 or 3 hours he encountered an obstacle. The iron made no impression, but met with a smooth surface. Dante touched it, and found that it was a beam. This beam crossed, or rather blocked up, the hole Dante has made. It was necessary, therefore, to dig above or under it. The unhappy young man had not thought of this. "Oh, my God, murmured he, "I have so earnestly prayed to you that I hoped my prayers had been heard. After having deprived me of my liberty, after having deprived me of death, after having recalled me to existence, my God, have pity on me, and do not let me die in despair." "Who talks of God and despair at the same time?" said a voice that seemed to come from beneath the earth, and, deadened by the distance, sounded hollow and sepulchral in the young man's ears. Edmund's hair stood on end, and he rose to his knees. "Ah," said he, "I hear a human voice." Edmund had not heard anyone speak save his jailer for 4 or 5 years, and a jailer is no man to a prisoner. He is a living door, a barrier of flesh and blood, adding strength to restraints of oak and iron. "In the name of heaven," cried Dante, "speak again, though the sound of your voice terrifies me. Who are you?" "Who are you?" said the voice. "An unhappy prisoner," replied Dante, who made no hesitation in answering. "Of what country?" "A Frenchman." "Your name?" "Edmond Dantès." "Your profession?" "A sailor." "How long have you been here?" "Since the 28th of February, 1815. "Your crime?" "I am innocent." "But of what are you accused?" "Of having conspired to aid the Emperor's return." "What? For the Emperor's return? The Emperor is no longer on the throne, then?" "He abdicated at Fontainebleau in 1814, and was sent to the island of Elba. But how long have you been here, that you are ignorant of all this?" "Since 1811. Dante shuddered. This man had been 4 years longer than himself in prison. "Do not dig any more," said the voice. "Only tell me, how high up is your excavation?" "On a level with the floor." "How is it concealed?" "Behind my bed." "Has your bed been moved since you have been a prisoner?" "No." "What does your chamber open on?" "A corridor." "And the corridor?" "On a court." "Alas!" murmured the voice. "Oh, what is the matter?" cried Dante. "I have made a mistake, owing to an error in my plans. I took the wrong angle, and have come out 15 feet from where I intended. I took the wall you are mining for the outer wall of the fortress." "But then you would be close to the sea." "That is what I hoped." "And supposing you had succeeded?" "I should have thrown myself into the sea, gained one of the islands near here, the Isle de Dôme or the Isle de Tipulin, and then I should have been safe." "Could you have swum so far?" "Heaven would have given me strength, but now all is lost." "All?" "Yes. Stop up your excavation carefully. Do not work any more, and wait until you hear from me." "Tell me at least who you are." I am number 27. "You mistrust me, then," said Dante. Edmund fancied he heard a bitter laugh resounding from the depths. "Oh, I am a Christian!" cried Dante, guessing instinctively that this man meant to abandon him. "I swear to you by him who died for us that naught shall induce me to breathe one syllable to my jailers. But I conjure you, do not abandon me. If you do, I swear to you, for I have got to the end of my strength, that I will dash my brains out against the wall, and you will have my death to reproach yourself with." "How old are you? Your voice is that of a young man." "I do not know my age, for I have not counted the years I have been here. All I do know is that I was just 19 when I was arrested, the 28th of February, 1815. "Not quite 26, murmured the voice. "At that age he could not be a traitor." "Oh, no, no!" cried Dante. "I swear to you again, rather than betray you, I would allow myself to be hacked in pieces." "You have done well to speak to me, and ask for my assistance, for I was about to form another plan and leave you. But your age reassures me. I will not forget you. Wait." "How long?" "I must calculate our chances. I will give you the signal." "But you will not leave me. You will come to me, or you will let me come to you. We will escape, and if we cannot escape, we will talk. You of those whom you love, and I of those whom I love. You must love somebody." "No, I am alone in the world." "Then you will love me, If you are young, I will be your comrade. If you are old, I will be your son. I have a father who is 70 if he yet lives. I only love him and a young girl called Mercedes. My father has not yet forgotten me, I am sure, but God alone knows if she loves me still. I shall love you as I loved my father." "It is well," returned the voice. "Tomorrow." These few words were uttered with an accent that left no doubt of his sincerity. Dante rose, dispersed the fragments with the same precaution as before, and pushed his bed back against the wall. He then gave himself up to his happiness. He would no longer be alone. He was, perhaps, about to regain his liberty. At the worst, he would have a companion, and captivity that is shared is but half captivity. Plaints made in common are almost prayers, and prayers where 2 or 3 are gathered together invoke the mercy of heaven. All day Dante walked up and down his cell. He sat down occasionally on his bed, pressing his hand on his heart. At the slightest noise he bounded towards the door. Once or twice the thought crossed his mind that he might be separated from this unknown, whom he loved already, and then his mind was made up. When the jailer moved his bed and stooped to examine the opening, he would kill him with his water jug. He would be condemned to die, but he was about to die of grief and despair when this miraculous noise recalled him to life. The jailer came in the evening. Dante was on his bed. It seemed to him that thus he better guarded the unfinished opening. Doubtless there was a strange expression in his eyes, for the jailer said, "Come, are you going mad again?" Dante did not answer. He feared that the emotion of his voice would betray him. The jailer went away, shaking his head. Night came. Dante hoped that his neighbor would profit by the silence to address him, but he was mistaken. The next morning, however, just as he removed his bed from the wall, he heard 3 knocks. He threw himself on his knees. "Is it you?" said he. "I am here." "Is your jailer gone?" "Yes," said Dante. "He will not return until the evening, so that we have 12 hours before us." "I can work, then," said the voice. "Oh, yes, yes, this instant, I entreat you." In a moment that part of the floor on which Dante was resting his 2 hands, as he knelt with his head in the opening, suddenly gave way. He drew back smartly, while a mass of stones and earth disappeared in a hole that opened beneath the aperture he himself had formed. Then from the bottom of this passage, the depth of which it was impossible to measure, he saw appear, first the head, then the shoulders, and lastly the body of
towards the window, in order to obtain a better view of his features by the aid of the imperfect light that struggled through the grating. He was a man of small stature, with hair bleached rather by suffering and sorrow than by age. He had a deep-set, penetrating eye, almost buried beneath the thick grey eyebrow, and a long, and still black, beard reaching down to his breast. His thin face, deeply furrowed by care, and the bold outline of his strongly marked features, betokened a man more accustomed to exercise his mental faculties than his physical strength. Large drops of perspiration were now standing on his brow, while the garments that hung about him were so ragged that one could only guess at the pattern upon which they had originally been fashioned. The stranger might have numbered 60 or 65 years, but a certain briskness and appearance of vigour in his movements made it probable that he was aged more from captivity than the course of time. He received the enthusiastic greeting of his young acquaintance with evident pleasure, as though his chilled affections were rekindled and invigorated by his contact with one so warm and ardent. He thanked him with grateful cordiality for his kindly welcome, although he must at that moment have been suffering bitterly to find another dungeon where he had fondly reckoned on discovering a means of regaining his liberty. "Let us first see," said he, "whether it is possible to remove the traces of my entrance here. Our future tranquillity depends upon our jailers being entirely ignorant of it." Advancing to the opening, he stooped and raised the stone easily in spite of its weight. Then, fitting it into its place, he said, "You removed this stone very carelessly, but I suppose you had no tools to aid you." "Why," exclaimed Dantès with astonishment, "do you possess any?" "I made myself some, and with the exception of a file, I have all that is necessary, a chisel, pincers, and lever." Oh, how I should like to see these products of your industry and patience! Well, in the first place, here is my chisel." So saying, he displayed a sharp, strong blade, with a handle made of beechwood. "And with what did you contrive to make that?" inquired Dantès. "With one of the clamps of my bedstead, and this very tool has sufficed me to hollow out the road by which I came hither, a distance of about 50 feet." "50 feet!" responded Dantès, almost terrified. "Do not speak so loud, young man. Don't speak so loud. It frequently occurs in a state prison like this, that persons are stationed outside the doors of the cells purposely to overhear the conversation of the prisoners. But they believe I am shut up alone here." "That makes no difference." "Are you saying that you dug your way a distance of 50 feet to get here?" "I do. That is about the distance that separates your chamber from mine, only unfortunately I did not curve right, for want of the necessary geometric instruments to calculate my scale of proportion. Instead of taking an ellipse of 40 feet, I made it 50. I expected, as I told you, to reach the outer wall, pierce through it, and throw myself into the sea. I have, however, kept along the corridor on which your chamber opens, instead of going beneath it. My labour is all in vain, for I find that the corridor looks into a courtyard filled with soldiers." "That's true," said Dantès, "but the corridor you speak of only bounds one side of my cell. There are 3 others. Do you know anything of their situation?" "This one is built against the solid rock, and it would take 10 experienced miners, duly furnished with the requisite tools, as many years to perforate it. This adjoins the lower part of the governor's apartments, and were we to work our way through, we should only get into some lock-up cells, where we must necessarily be recaptured. The 4th and last side of your cell faces on... Stop a minute. Now where does it face?" The wall of which he spoke was the one in which was fixed the loophole by which light was admitted to the chamber. This loophole, which gradually diminished in size as it approached the outside to an opening through which a child could not have passed, was, for better security, furnished with 3 iron bars, so as to quiet all apprehensions, even in the mind of the most suspicious jailer, as to the possibility of a prisoner's escape. As the stranger asked the question, he dragged the table beneath the window. "Climb up," said he to Dantès. The young man obeyed, mounted on the table, and, divining the wishes of his companion, placed his back securely against the wall, and held out both hands. The stranger, whom as yet Dantès knew only by the number of his cell, sprang up with an agility by no means to be expected in a person of his years, and, light and steady on his feet as a cat or a lizard, climbed from the table to the outstretched hands of Dantès, and from them to his shoulders. Then, bending double, for the ceiling of the dungeon prevented him from holding himself erect, he managed to slip his head between the upper bars of the window, so as to be able to command a perfect view from top to bottom. An instant afterwards he hastily drew back his head, saying, "I thought so," and sliding from the shoulders of Dantès as dexterously as he had descended, he nimbly leaped from the table to the ground. "What was it that you thought?" asked the young man anxiously, in his turn descending from the table. The elder prisoner pondered the matter. "Yes," said he at length, "it is so. This side of your chamber looks out upon a kind of open gallery, where patrols are continually passing, and sentries keep watch day and night." "Are you quite sure of that?" "Certain. I saw the soldier's shape and the top of his musket. That made me draw my head in so quickly, for I was frightful he might also see me." "Well?" inquired Dantès. "You perceive then the utter impossibility of escaping through your dungeon?" "Then," pursued the young man eagerly, "then," answered the elder prisoner, "the will of God will be done." And as the old man slowly pronounced those words, an air of profound resignation spread itself over his careworn countenance. Dantès gazed on the man who could thus philosophically resign hopes so long and ardently nourished, with an astonishment mingled with admiration. "Tell me, I entreat of you, who and what you are," said he at length. "Never have I met with so remarkable a person as yourself." "Willingly," answered the stranger, "if indeed you feel any curiosity respecting one, now, alas, powerless to aid you in any way." "Say not so. You can counsel and support me by the strength of your own powerful mind. Pray let me know who you really are." The stranger smiled a melancholy smile. "Then listen," said he. "I am the Abbé Faria, and have been imprisoned, as you know, in this Château d'Elf since the year 1811, previously to which I had been confined for 3 years in the fortress of Fenestrella. In the year 1811 I was transferred to Piedmont in France. It was at this period I learned that the destiny which seemed subservient to every wish formed by Napoleon had bestowed on him a son, named King of Rome even in his cradle. I was very far then from expecting the change you have just informed me of, namely, that 4 years afterwards this colossus of power would be overthrown. Then who reigns in France at this moment? Napoleon II? No, Louis XVIII. The brother of Louis XVII? How inscrutable are the ways of Providence! For what great and mysterious purpose has it pleased Heaven to abase the man once so elevated, and rise up him who was so abased?" Dantès' whole attention was riveted on a man who could thus forget his own misfortunes while occupying himself with the destinies of others. "Yes, yes," continued he, "'twill be the same as it were in England. After Charles I, Cromwell; after Cromwell, Charles II, and then James II, and then some son-in-law or relation, some Prince of Orange, a stadtholder, who becomes a king; then new concessions to the people, then a constitution, then liberty. Ah, my friend," said the abbé, turning towards Dantès, and surveying him with the kindling gaze of a prophet, "you are young, you will see all this come to pass." "Probably, if I ever get out of prison." "True," replied Faria. "We are prisoners, but I forget this sometimes, and there are even moments when my mental vision transports me beyond these walls, and I fancy myself at liberty." "But wherefore are you here?" "Because in 1807 I dreamed of the very plan Napoleon tried to realize in 1811; because, like Machiavelli, I desired to alter the political face of Italy, and instead of allowing it to be split up into a quantity of petty principalities, each held by some weak or tyrannical ruler, I sought to form one large, compact, and powerful empire; and lastly, because I fancied I had found my Caesar Borgia in a crowned simpleton, who feigned to enter into my views only to betray me. It was the plan of Alexander VI. And Clement VII., but it will never succeed now, for they attempted it fruitlessly, and Napoleon was unable to complete his work. Italy seems fated to misfortune." And the old man bowed his head. Dantès could not understand a man risking his life for such matters. Napoleon certainly he knew something of, inasmuch as he had seen and spoken with him. But of Clement VII. And Alexander VI. he knew nothing. "Are you not," he asked, "the priest who here in the Château d'Elf is generally thought to be ill?" "Mad, you mean, don't you?" "I do not like to say so," answered Dantès, smiling. "Well, then," resumed Faria with a bitter smile, "let me answer your question in full, by acknowledging that I am the poor mad prisoner of the Château d'Elf, for many years permitted to amuse the different visitors with what is said to be my insanity, and in all probability I should be promoted to the honour of making sport for the children, if such innocent beings could be found in an abode devoted like this to suffering and despair." Dantès remained for a short time mute and motionless. At length he said, "Then you abandon all hope of escape?" "I perceive its utter impossibility, and I consider it impious to attempt that which the Almighty evidently does not approve. Nay, be not discouraged. Would it not be expecting too much to hope to succeed at your first attempt? Why not try to find an opening in another direction from that which has so unfortunately failed? Alas, it shows how little notion you can have of all it has cost me to effect a purpose so unexpectedly frustrated, that you talk of beginning over again. In the first place, I was 4 years making the tools I possess, and have been 2 years scraping and digging out earth, hard as granite itself. Then what toil and fatigue has it not been to remove huge stones I should once have deemed impossible to loosen? Whole days have I passed in these titanic efforts, considering my labour well repaid, if, by night time, I had contrived to carry away a square inch of this hard-bound cement, changed by ages into a substance unyielding as the stones themselves. Then, to conceal the mass of earth and rubbish I dug up, I was compelled to break through a staircase, and throw the fruits of my labour into the hollow part of it. But this well is now so completely choked up, that I scarcely think it would be possible to add another handful of dust without leading to discovery. Consider also that I fully believed I had accomplished the end and aim of my undertaking, for which I had so exactly husbanded my strength as to make it just hold out to the termination of my enterprise. And now, at the moment when I reckoned upon success, my hopes are forever dashed from me. No, I repeat again, that nothing shall induce me to renew attempts evidently at variance with the Almighty's pleasure." Dantès held down his head, that the other might not see how joy at the thought of having a companion outweighed the sympathy he felt for the failure of the abbé's plans. The abbé sank upon Edmund's bed, while Edmund himself remained standing. Escape had never once occurred to him. There are indeed some things which appear so impossible that the mind does not dwell on them for an instant. To undermine the ground for 50 feet, to devote 3 years to a labour which, if successful, would conduct you to a precipice overhanging the sea, to plunge into the waves from the height of 50, 60, perhaps 100 feet, at the risk of being dashed to pieces against the rocks, should you have been fortunate enough to have escaped the fire of the sentinels. And even, supposing all these perils past, then to have to swim for your life at a distance of at least 3 miles ere you could reach the shore, were difficulties so startling and formidable that Dantès had never even dreamed of such a scheme, resigning himself rather to death. But the sight of an old man clinging to life with so desperate a courage gave a fresh turn to his ideas, and inspired him with new courage. Another, older and less strong than he, had attempted what he had not had sufficient resolution to undertake, and had failed only because of an error in calculation. This same person, who with almost incredible patience and perseverance had contrived to provide himself with tools requisite for so unparalleled an attempt. Another had done all this. Why, then, was it impossible to Dantès? Faria had dug his way through 50 feet. Dantès would dig 100. Faria, at the age of 50, had devoted 3 years to the task. He, who was but half as old, would sacrifice 6. Faria, a priest and savant, had not shrunk from the idea of risking his life by trying to swim a distance of 3 miles to one of the islands, Domire, Retoniou, or Limar. Should a hardy sailor, an experienced diver, like himself, shrink from a similar task? Should he, who had so often for mere amusement's sake plunged to the bottom of the sea to fetch up the bright coral branch, hesitate to entertain the same project? He could do it in an hour, and how many times had he, for pure pastime, continued in the water for more than twice as long? At once Dantès resolved to follow the brave example of his energetic companion, and to remember that what has once been done may be done again. After continuing some time in profound meditation, the young man suddenly exclaimed, "I have found what you are in search of." Faria started. "Have you indeed?" cried he, raising his head with quick anxiety. Pray let me know what it is you have discovered." "The corridor through which you have bored your way from the cell you occupy here extends in the same direction as the outer gallery, does it not?" "It does." "And is not above 15 feet from it?" "About that." "Well, then, I will tell you what we must do. We must pierce through the corridor by forming a side opening about the middle, as if it were the top part of a cross. This time you will lay your plans more accurately. We shall get out into the gallery you have described, kill the sentinel who guards it, and make our escape. All we require to ensure success is courage, and that you possess, and strength, which I am not deficient in. As for patience, you have abundantly proved yours. You shall now see me prove mine." "One instant, my dear friend," replied the abbé. "It is clear you do not understand the nature of the courage with which I am endowed, and what use I intend making of my strength. As for patience, I consider that I have abundantly exercised that in beginning every morning the task of the night before, and every night renewing the task of the day. But then, young man, and I pray of you to give me your full attention, then I thought I could not be doing anything displeasing to the Almighty in trying to set an innocent being at liberty, one who had committed no offence and merited no condemnation." "And have your notions changed?" asked Dantès with much surprise. "Do you think yourself more guilty in making the attempt, since you have encountered me?" "No, neither do I wish to incur guilt. Hitherto I have fancied myself merely waging war against circumstances, not men. I have thought it no sin to bore through a wall or destroy a staircase, but I cannot so easily persuade myself to pierce a heart or take away a life." A slight movement of surprise escaped Dantès. "Is it possible," said he, "that where your liberty is at stake you can allow any such scruple to deter you from obtaining it?" "Tell me," replied Faria, "what has hindered you from knocking down your jailer with a piece of wood torn from your bedstead, dressing yourselves in his clothes, and endeavouring to escape?" "Simply the fact that the idea never occurred to me," answered Dantès. "Because," said the old man, "the natural repugnance to the commission of such a crime prevented you from thinking of it, and so it ever is because, in simple and allowable things, our natural instincts keep us from deviating from the strict line of duty. The tiger, whose nature teaches him to delight in shedding blood, needs but the sense of smell to show him when his prey is within his reach, and by following this instinct he is enabled to measure the leap necessary to permit him to spring on his victim. But man, on the contrary, loathes the idea of blood. It is not alone that the laws of social life inspire him with a shrinking dread of taking life. His natural construction and physiological formation—" Dantès was confused and silent at this explanation of the thoughts which had unconsciously been working in his mind, or rather soul. For there are two distinct sorts of ideas, those that proceed from the head and those that emanate from the heart. "Since my imprisonment," said Faria, "I have thought over all the most celebrated cases of escape on record. They have rarely been successful. Those that have been crowned with full success have been long meditated upon and carefully arranged. Such, for instance, as the escape of the Duc de Buffon from the Château de Vincennes, that of the Abbé Dubequie from Fort-l'Évêque, of Latude from the Bastille. Then there are those for which chance sometimes affords opportunity, and those are the best of us. Let us, therefore, wait patiently for some favourable moment, and when it presents itself, profit by it." "Ah," said Dantès, "you might well endure the tedious delay. You were constantly employed in the task you set yourself, and when weary with toil, you had your hopes to refresh and encourage you." "I assure you," replied the old man, "I do not turn to that source for recreation or support." "What did you do, then?" "I wrote or studied." "Were you then permitted the use of pens, ink, and paper?" "Oh, no," answered the abbé. "I had none but what I made for myself." "You made paper, pens, and ink?" "Yes." Dantès gazed with admiration, but he had some difficulty in believing. Faria saw this. "When you pay me a visit in my cell, my young friend," said he, "I will show you an entire work, the fruits of the thoughts and reflections of my whole life, many of them meditated over in the shades of the Colosseum at Rome, at the foot of St. Mark's column at Venice, and on the borders of the Arno at Florence, little imagining at the time that they would be arranged in order within the walls of the Château d'If. The work I speak of is called A Treatise on the Possibility of a General Monarchy in Italy, and will make one large quarto volume." "And on what have you written all this?" "On two of my shirts. I invented a preparation that makes lines as smooth and easy to write on as parchment." "You are, then, a chemist?" "Somewhat. I know Lavoisier, and was the intimate friend of Cabanis." "But for such works you must have needed books. Had you any?" "I had nearly 5,000 in my library at Rome, but after reading them over many years, I found out that with 150 well-chosen books, a man possesses, if not a complete summary of all human knowledge, at least all that a man need really know. I devoted 3 years of my life to reading and studying these 150 volumes, till I knew them nearly by heart, so that since I have been in prison, a very slight effort of memory has enabled me to recall their contents as readily as though the pages were open before me. I could recite you the whole of Thucydides, Xenophon, Plutarch, Titus Livius, Tacitus, Strada, John Andus, Dante, Montaigne, Shakespeare, Spinoza, Machiavelli, and Bossuet. I name only the most important." "You are doubtless acquainted with a variety of languages, so as to be enabled to read all these?" "Yes, I speak 5 of the modern tongues, that is to say, German, French, Italian, English, and Spanish. By the aid of ancient Greek I learned modern Greek. I don't speak it so well as I could wish, but I am still trying to improve myself." "Improve yourself?" repeated Dantès. "Why, how can you manage to do so?" "Why, I made a vocabulary of the words I knew, turned, returned, and arranged them, so as to enable me to express my thoughts through their medium. I know nearly 1,000 words, which is all that is absolutely necessary, although I believe there are nearly 100,000 in the dictionaries. I cannot hope to be very fluent, but I certainly should have no difficulty in explaining my wants and wishes, and that would be quite as much as I should ever require." Stronger grew the wonder of Dantès, who almost fancied he had to do with one gifted with supernatural powers. Still hoping to find some imperfection which might bring him down to a level with human beings, he added, "Then, if you were not furnished with pens, how did you manage to write the work which you speak of?" "I made myself some excellent ones, which would be universally preferred to all others if once known. You are aware what huge whitings are served to us on maigre days. Well, I selected the cartilages of the heads of these fishes, and you can scarcely imagine the delight with which I welcome the arrival of each Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday, as affording me the means of increasing my stock of pens. For I will freely confess that my historical labours have been my greatest solace and relief. While retracing the past, I forget the present, and traversing at will the path of history, I cease to remember that I am myself a prisoner." "But the ink?" said Dantès. "Of what do you make your ink?" "There was formerly a fireplace in my dungeon," replied Faria, "but it was closed up long ere I became an occupant of this prison. Still, it must have been many years in use, for it was thickly covered with a coating of soot. This soot I dissolved in a portion of the wine brought to me every Sunday, and I assure you a better ink cannot be desired. For very important notes, for which closer attention is required, I pricked one of my fingers, and wrote with my own blood." "And when," asked Dantès, "may I see all this?" "Whenever you please," replied the abbé. "Oh, then let it be directly!" exclaimed the young man. Dantès almost carried him towards the window, in order to obtain a better view of his features by the aid of the imperfect light that struggled through the grating. He was a man of small stature, with hair bleached rather by suffering and sorrow than by age. He had a deep-set, penetrating eye, almost buried beneath the thick grey eyebrow, and a long, and still black, beard reaching down to his breast. His thin face, deeply furrowed by care, and the bold outline of his strongly marked features, betokened a man more accustomed to exercise his mental faculties than his physical strength. Large drops of perspiration were now standing on his brow, while the garments that hung about him were so ragged that one could only guess at the pattern upon which they had originally been fashioned. The stranger might have numbered 60 or 65 years, but a certain briskness and appearance of vigour in his movements made it probable that he was aged more from captivity than the course of time. He received the enthusiastic greeting of his young acquaintance with evident pleasure, as though his chilled affections were rekindled and invigorated by his contact with one so warm and ardent. He thanked him with grateful cordiality for his kindly welcome, although he must at that moment have been suffering bitterly to find another dungeon where he had fondly reckoned on discovering a means of regaining his liberty. "Let us first see," said he, "whether it is possible to remove the traces of my entrance here. Our future tranquillity depends upon our jailers being entirely ignorant of it." Advancing to the opening, he stooped and raised the stone easily in spite of its weight. Then, fitting it into its place, he said, "You removed this stone very carelessly, but I suppose you had no tools to aid you." "Why," exclaimed Dantès with astonishment, "do you possess any?" "I made myself some, and with the exception of a file, I have all that is necessary, a chisel, pincers, and lever." "Oh, how I should like to see these products of your industry and patience!" "Well, in the first place, here is my chisel." So saying, he displayed a sharp, strong blade, with a handle made of beechwood. "And with what did you contrive to make that?" inquired Dantès. "With one of the clamps of my bedstand, and this very tool has sufficed me to hollow out the road by which I came hither, a distance of about 50 feet." "50 feet!" responded Dantès, almost terrified. "Do not speak so loud, young man. Don't speak so loud. It frequently occurs in a state prison like this, that persons are stationed outside the doors of the cells purposely to overhear the conversation of the prisoners. But they believe I am shut up alone here." "That makes no difference." "Are you saying that you dug your way a distance of 50 feet to get here?" "I do. That is about the distance that separates your chamber from mine, only unfortunately I did not curve right, for want of the necessary geometric instruments to calculate my scale of proportion. Instead of taking an ellipse of 40 feet, I made it 50. I expected, as I told you, to reach the outer wall, pierce through it, and throw myself into the sea. I have, however, kept along the corridor on which your chamber opens, instead of going beneath it. My labour is all in vain, for I find that the corridor looks into a courtyard filled with soldiers." "That's true," said Dantès, "but the corridor you speak of only bounds one side of my cell. There are 3 others. Do you know anything of their situation?" "This one is built against the solid rock, and it would take 10 experienced miners, duly furnished with the requisite tools, as many years to perforate it. This adjoins the lower part of the governor's apartments, and were we to work our way through, we should only get into some lock-up cells, where we must necessarily be recaptured. The 4th and last side of your cell faces on... Stop a minute. Now where does it face?" The wall of which he spoke was the one in which was fixed the loophole by which light was admitted to the chamber. This loophole, which gradually diminished in size as it approached the outside to an opening through which a child could not have passed, was, for better security, furnished with 3 iron bars, so as to quiet all apprehensions even in the mind of the most suspicious jailer as to the possibility of a prisoner's escape. As the stranger asked the question, he dragged the table beneath the window. "Climb up," said he to Dantès. The young man obeyed, mounted on the table, and, divining the wishes of his companion, placed his back securely against the wall and held out both hands. The stranger, whom as yet Dantès knew only by the number of his cell, sprang up with an agility by no means to be expected in a person of his years, and, light and steady on his feet as a cat or a lizard, climbed from the table to the outstretched hands of Dantès, and from them to his shoulders. Then, bending double, for the ceiling of the dungeon prevented him from holding himself erect, he managed to slip his head between the upper bars of the window, so as to be able to command a perfect view from top to bottom. An instant afterwards he hastily drew back his head, saying, "I thought so," and sliding from the shoulders of Dantès as dexterously as he had descended, he nimbly leaped from the table to the ground. "What was it that you thought?" asked the young man anxiously, in his turn descending from the table. The elder prisoner pondered the matter. "Yes," said he at length, "it is so. This side of your chamber looks out upon a kind of open gallery, where patrols are continually passing, and sentries keep watch day and night." "Are you quite sure of that?" "Certain. I saw the soldier's shape and the top of his musket. That made me draw my head in so quickly, for I was frightful he might also see me." "Well?" inquired Dantès. "You perceive then the utter impossibility of escaping through your dungeon?" "Then," pursued the young man eagerly, "then," answered the elder prisoner, "the will of God will be done." And as the old man slowly pronounced those words, an air of profound resignation spread itself over his careworn countenance. Dantès gazed on the man who could thus philosophically resign hopes so long and ardently nourished, with an astonishment mingled with admiration. "Tell me, I entreat of you, who and what you are," said he at length. "Never have I met with so remarkable a person as yourself." "Willingly," answered the stranger, "if indeed you feel any curiosity respecting one, now, alas, powerless to aid you in any way." "Say not so. You can counsel and support me by the strength of your own powerful mind. Pray let me know who you really are." The stranger smiled a melancholy smile. "Then listen," said he. "I am the Abbé Faria, and have been imprisoned, as you know, in this Château d'Elf since the year 1811, previously to which I had been confined for 3 years in the fortress of Fenestrella. In the year 1811 I was transferred to Piedmont in France. It was at this period I learned that the destiny which seemed subservient to every wish formed by Napoleon had bestowed on him a son, named King of Rome even in his cradle. I was very far then from expecting the change you have just informed me of, namely, that 4 years afterwards this colossus of power would be overthrown. Then who reigns in France at this moment? Napoleon II? No, Louis XVIII. The brother of Louis XVII? How inscrutable are the ways of Providence! For what great and mysterious purpose has it pleased Heaven to abase the man once so elevated, and rise up him who was so abased?" Dantès' whole attention was riveted on a man who could thus forget his own misfortunes while occupying himself with the destinies of others. "Yes, yes," continued he, "'twill be the same as it were in England. After Charles I, Cromwell; after Cromwell, Charles II, and then James II, and then some son-in-law or relation, some Prince of Orange, a stadtholder, who becomes a king; then new concessions to the people, then a constitution, then liberty. Ah, my friend," said the abbé, turning towards Dantès, and surveying him with the kindling gaze of a prophet. "You are young. You will see all this come to pass."
"Probably, if I ever get out of prison."
"True," replied Farrier. "We are prisoners, but I forget this sometimes, and there are even moments when my mental vision transports me beyond these walls, and I fancy myself at liberty."
"But wherefore are you here?"
"Because in 1807 I dreamed of the very plan Napoleon tried to realize in 1811. Because, like Machiavelli, I desired to alter the political face of Italy, and instead of allowing it to be split up into a quantity of petty principalities, each held by some weak or tyrannical ruler, I sought to form one large, compact, and powerful empire. And lastly, because I fancied I had found my Caesar Borgia in a crowned simpleton, who feigned to enter into my views only to betray me. It was the plan of Alexander VI. And Clement VII., but it will never succeed now, for they attempted it fruitlessly, and Napoleon was unable to complete his work. Italy seems fated to misfortune." And the old man bowed his head. Dantès could not understand a man risking his life for such matters. Napoleon certainly he knew something of, inasmuch as he had seen and spoken with him. But of Clement VII. And Alexander VI. he knew nothing.
"Are you not," he asked, "the priest who here in the Chateau d'Elf is generally thought to be ill?"
"Mad, you mean, don't you?"
"I do not like to say so," answered Dantès, smiling.
"Well, then," resumed Farrier with a bitter smile, "let me answer your question in full by acknowledging that I am the poor mad prisoner of the Chateau d'Elf, for many years permitted to amuse the different visitors with what is said to be my insanity, and in all probability I should be promoted to the honour of making sport for the children, if such innocent beings could be found in an abode devoted like this to suffering and despair."
Dantès remained for a short time mute and motionless. At length he said, "Then you abandon all hope of escape?"
"I perceive its utter impossibility, and I consider it impious to attempt that which the Almighty evidently does not approve."
"Nay, be not discouraged. Would it not be expecting too much to hope to succeed at your first attempt? Why not try to find an opening in another direction from that which has so unfortunately failed?"
"Alas, it shows how little notion you can have of all it has cost me to effect a purpose so unexpectedly frustrated, that you talk of beginning over again. In the first place, I was 4 years making the tools I possess, and have been 2 years scraping and digging out earth, hard as granite itself. Then what toil and fatigue has it not been to remove huge stones I should once have deemed impossible to loosen? Whole days have I passed in these titanic efforts, considering my labour well repaid if, by night time, I had contrived to carry away a square inch of this hard-bound cement, changed by ages into a substance unyielding as the stones themselves. Then, to conceal the mass of earth and rubbish I dug up, I was compelled to break through a staircase, and throw the fruits of my labour into the hollow part of it. But this well is now so completely choked up, that I scarcely think it would be possible to add another handful of dust without leading to discovery. Consider also that I fully believed I had accomplished the end and aim of my undertaking, for which I had so exactly husbanded my strength as to make it just hold out to the termination of my enterprise. And now, at the moment when I reckoned upon success, my hopes are forever dashed from me. No, I repeat again, that nothing shall induce me to renew attempts evidently at variance with the Almighty's pleasure."
Dantès held down his head, that the other might not see how joy at the thought of having a companion outweighed the sympathy he felt for the failure of the abbé's plans. The abbé sank upon Edmund's bed, while Edmund himself remained standing. Escape had never once occurred to him. There are indeed some things which appear so impossible that the mind does not dwell on them for an instant. To undermine the ground for 50 feet, to devote 3 years to a labour which, if successful, would conduct you to a precipice overhanging the sea,
to plunge into the waves from the height of 50, 60, perhaps 100 feet, at the risk of being dashed to pieces against the rocks, should you have been fortunate enough to have escaped the fire of the sentinels; and even, supposing all these perils past, then to have to swim for your life at a distance of at least 3 miles ere you could reach the shore, were difficulties so startling and formidable that Dantès had never even dreamed of such a scheme, resigning himself rather to death. But the sight of an old man clinging to life with so desperate a courage gave a fresh turn to his ideas, and inspired him with new courage. Another, older and less strong than he, had attempted what he had not had sufficient resolution to undertake, and had failed only because of an error in calculation. This same person, who with almost incredible patience and perseverance had contrived to provide himself with tools requisite for so unparalleled an attempt. Another had done all this. Why, then, was it impossible to Dantès? Faria had dug his way through 50 feet. Dantès would dig 100. Faria, at the age of 50, had devoted 3 years to the task. He, who was but half as old, would sacrifice 6. Faria, a priest and savant, had not shrunk from the idea of risking his life by trying to swim a distance of 3 miles to one of the islands, Domire, Retoniou, or Limar. Should a hardy sailor, an experienced diver, like himself, shrink from a similar task? Should he, who had so often for mere amusement's sake plunged to the bottom of the sea to fetch up the bright coral branch, hesitate to entertain the same project? He could do it in an hour, and how many times had he, for pure pastime, continued in the water for more than twice as long? At once Dantès resolved to follow the brave example of his energetic companion, and to remember that what has once been done may be done again. After continuing some time in profound meditation, the young man suddenly exclaimed, "I have found what you were in search of." Faria started. "Have you indeed?" cried he, raising his head with quick anxiety. "Pray let me know what it is you have discovered." "The corridor through which you have bored your way from the cell you occupy here extends in the same direction as the outer gallery, does it not?" "It does." "And is not above 15 feet from it?" "About that." "Well, then, I will tell you what we must do. We must pierce through the corridor by forming a side opening about the middle, as if it were the top part of a cross. This time you will lay your plans more accurately. We shall get out into the gallery you have described, kill the sentinels who guards it, and make our escape. All we require to ensure success is courage, and that you possess, and strength, which I am not deficient in. As for patience, you have abundantly proved yours. You shall now see me prove mine." "One instant, my dear friend," replied the abbé. "It is clear you do not understand the nature of the courage with which I am endowed, and what use I intend making of my strength. As for patience, I consider that I have abundantly exercised that in beginning every morning the task of the night before, and every night renewing the task of the day. But then, young man, and I pray of you to give me your full attention, then I thought I could not be doing anything displeasing to the Almighty in trying to set an innocent being at liberty, one who had committed no offence and merited no condemnation." "And have your notions changed?" asked Dantès with much surprise. "Do you think yourself more guilty in making the attempt, since you have encountered me?" "No, neither do I wish to incur guilt. Hitherto I have fancied myself merely waging war against circumstances, not men. I have thought it no sin to bore through a wall or destroy a staircase, but I cannot so easily persuade myself to pierce a heart or take away a life." A slight movement of surprise escaped Dantès. "Is it possible," said he, "that where your liberty is at stake you can allow any such scruple to deter you from obtaining it?" "Tell me," replied Faria, What has hindered you from knocking down your jailer with a piece of wood torn from your bedstead, dressing yourselves in his clothes, and endeavouring to escape?" "Simply the fact that the idea never occurred to me," answered Dantès. "Because," said the old man, "the natural repugnance to the commission of such a crime prevented you from thinking of it, and so it ever is because, in simple and allowable things, our natural instincts keep us from deviating from the strict line of duty. The tiger, whose nature teaches him to delight in shedding blood, needs but the sense of smell to show him when his prey is within his reach, and by following this instinct he is enabled to measure the leap necessary to permit him to spring on his victim. But man, on the contrary, loathes the idea of blood. It is not alone that the laws of social life inspire him with a shrinking dread of taking life. His natural construction and physiological formation—" Dantès was confused and silent at this explanation of the thoughts which had unconsciously been working in his mind, or rather soul. For there are two distinct sorts of ideas, those that proceed from the head and those that emanate from the heart. "Since my imprisonment," said Faria, "I have thought over all the most celebrated cases of escape on record. They have rarely been successful. Those that have been crowned with full success have been long meditated upon and carefully arranged. Such, for instance, as the escape of the Duc de Buffon from the Château de Vincennes, that of the Abbé Dubequie from Fort-l'Évêque, of Latude from the Bastille. Then there are those for which chance sometimes affords opportunity, and those are the best of us. Let us, therefore, wait patiently for some favourable moment, and when it presents itself, profit by it." "Ah," said Dantès, "you might well endure the tedious delay. You were constantly employed in the task you set yourself, and when weary with toil, you had your hopes to refresh and encourage you." "I assure you," replied the old man, "I do not turn to that source for recreation or support." "What did you do, then?" "I wrote or studied." "Were you then permitted the use of pens, ink, and paper?" "Oh, no," answered the abbé. "I had none but what I made for myself." "You made paper, pens, and ink?" "Yes." Dantès gazed with admiration, but he had some difficulty in believing. Faria saw this. "When you pay me a visit in my cell, my young friend," said he, "I will show you an entire work, the fruits of the thoughts and reflections of my whole life, many of them meditated over in the shades of the Colosseum at Rome, at the foot of St. Mark's column at Venice, and on the borders of the Arno at Florence, little imagining at the time that they would be arranged in order within the walls of the Château d'If. The work I speak of is called A Treatise on the Possibility of a General Monarchy in Italy, and will make one large quarto volume." "And on what have you written all this?" "On two of my shirts. I invented a preparation that makes lines as smooth and easy to write on as parchment." "You are, then, a chemist?" "Somewhat. I know Lavoisier, and was the intimate friend of Cabanis." "But for such works you must have needed books. Had you any?" "I had nearly 5,000 in my library at Rome, but after reading them over many years, I found out that with 150 well-chosen books, a man possesses, if not a complete summary of all human knowledge, at least all that a man need really know. I devoted 3 years of my life to reading and studying these 150 volumes, till I knew them nearly by heart, so that since I have been in prison, a very slight effort of memory has enabled me to recall their contents as readily as though the pages were open before me. I could recite you the whole of Thucydides, Xenophon, Plutarch, Titus Livius, Tacitus, Strada, John Andus, Dante, Montaigne, Shakespeare, Spinoza, Machiavelli, and Bossuet. I name only the most important." You are doubtless acquainted with a variety of languages, so as to be able to read all these? Yes, I speak 5 of the modern tongues, that is to say, German, French, Italian, English, and Spanish. By the aid of ancient Greek I learned modern Greek. I don't speak it so well as I could wish, but I am still trying to improve myself." "Improve yourself?" repeated Dantès. "Why, how can you manage to do so?" "Why, I made a vocabulary of the words I knew, turned, returned, and arranged them, so as to enable me to express my thoughts through their medium. I know nearly 1,000 words, which is all that is absolutely necessary, although I believe there are nearly 100,000 in the dictionaries. I cannot hope to be very fluent, but I certainly should have no difficulty in explaining my wants and wishes, and that would be quite as much as I should ever require." Stronger grew the wonder of Dantès, who almost fancied he had to do with one gifted with supernatural powers. Still hoping to find some imperfection which might bring him down to a level with human beings, he added, "Then, if you were not furnished with pens, how did you manage to write the work which you speak of?" "I made myself some excellent ones, which would be universally preferred to all others if once known. You are aware what huge whitings are served to us on maigre days. Well, I selected the cartilages of the heads of these fishes, and you can scarcely imagine the delight with which I welcome the arrival of each Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday, as affording me the means of increasing my stock of pens. For I will freely confess that my historical labours have been my greatest solace and relief. While retracing the past, I forget the present, and traversing at will the path of history, I cease to remember that I am myself a prisoner." "But the ink," said Dantès. "Of what do you make your ink?" "There was formerly a fireplace in my dungeon," replied Faria, "but it was closed up long ere I became an occupant of this prison. Still, it must have been many years in use, for it was thickly covered with a coating of soot. This soot I dissolved in a portion of the wine brought to me every Sunday, and I assure you a better ink cannot be desired. For very important notes, for which closer attention is required, I pricked one of my fingers, and wrote with my own blood." "And when?" asked Dantès. "May I see all this?" "Whenever you please," replied the abbé. "Oh, then let it be directly!" exclaimed the young man.
In the ray of light which entered by the narrow window of his cell, he held open in his left hand, of which alone it will be recollected he retained the use, a sheet of paper which, from being constantly rolled into a small compass, had the form of a cylinder, and was not easily kept open. He did not speak, but showed the paper to Dantès. "What is that?" he inquired. "Look at it," said the abbé with a smile. "I have looked at it with all possible attention," said Dantès, "and I only see a half-burnt paper, on which are traces of Gothic characters inscribed with a peculiar kind of ink." "This paper, my friend," said Faria, "I may now avow to you, since I have the proof of your fidelity. This paper is my treasure, of which, from this day forth, 1/2 belongs to you." The sweat started forth on Dantès' brow. Until this day, and for how long a time, he had refrained from talking of the treasure, which had brought upon the abbé the accusation of madness. With his instinctive delicacy, Edmond had preferred avoiding any touch on this painful chord, and Faria had been equally silent. He had taken the silence of the old man for a return to reason, and now these few words uttered by Faria, after so painful a crisis, seemed to indicate a serious relapse into mental alienation. "Your treasure?" stammered Dantès. Faria smiled. "Yes," said he, "you have indeed a noble nature, Edmond, and I see by your paleness and agitation what is passing in your heart at this moment. No, be assured I am not mad. This treasure exists, Dantès, and if I have not been allowed to possess it, you will. Yes, you. No one would listen or believe me, because everyone thought me mad, but you, who must know that I am not, listen to me, and believe me so afterwards, if you will." "Alas!" murmured Edmond to himself, "this is a terrible relapse. There was only this blow wanting." Then he said aloud, "My dear friend, your attack has, perhaps, fatigued you. Had you not better repose a while? To morrow, if you will, I will hear your narrative, but to day I wish to nurse you carefully. Besides," he said, "a treasure is not a thing we need hurry about." "On the contrary, it is a matter of the utmost importance, Edmond," replied the old man. "Who knows if to-morrow, or the next day after, the third attack may not come on, and then must not all be over? Yes, indeed, I have often thought with a bitter joy that these riches, which would make the wealth of a dozen families, will be for ever lost to those men who persecute me. This idea was one of vengeance to me, and I tasted it slowly, in the night of my dungeon and the despair of my captivity. But now I have forgiven the world for the love of you, now that I see you young and with a promising future, now that I think of all that may result to you in the good fortune of such a disclosure, I shudder at any delay, and tremble lest I should not assure to one as worthy as yourself the possession of so vast an amount of hidden wealth." Edmond turned away his head with a sigh. "You persist in your incredulity, Edmond," continued Faria. "My words have not convinced you. I see you require proofs. Well, then, read this paper, which I have never shown to any one." "To-morrow, my dear friend," said Edmond, desirous of not yielding to the old man's madness. "I thought it was understood that we should not talk of that until to-morrow." "Then we will not talk of it until to-morrow, but read this paper to-day." "I will not irritate him," thought Edmond, and taking the paper, of which half was wanting, having been burnt, no doubt, by some accident, he read: "This treasure, which may amount to 2 of Roman crowns in the most distant A of the second opening, declared to belong to him alone, heir, 25th April, 1490. "Well," said Faria, when the young man had finished reading it. "Why," replied Dantès, "I see nothing but broken lines and unconnected words, which are rendered illegible by fire." "Yes, to you, my friend, who read them for the first time, but not for me, who have grown pale over them by many nights' study, and have reconstructed every phrase, completed every thought." "And do you believe you have discovered the hidden meaning?" "I am sure I have, and you shall judge for yourself, but first listen to the history of this paper." "Silence!" exclaimed Dantès. "Steps approach. I go. Adieu." And Dantès, happy to escape the history and explanation which would be sure to confirm his belief in his friend's mental instability, glided like a snake along the narrow passage, while Faria, restored by his alarm into a certain amount of activity, pushed the stone into place with his foot and covered it with a mat in order the more effectually to avoid discovery. It was the governor who, hearing of Faria's illness from the jailer, had come in person to see him. Faria sat up to receive him, avoiding all gestures in order that he might conceal from the governor the paralysis that had already half stricken him with death. His fear was lest the governor, touched with pity, might order him to be removed to better quarters and thus separate him from his young companion. But fortunately this was not the case, and the governor left him convinced that the poor madman, for whom in his heart he felt a kind of affection, was only troubled with a slight indisposition. During this time Edmond, seated on his bed with his head in his hands, tried to collect his scattered thoughts. Faria, since their first acquaintance, had been on all points so rational and logical, so wonderfully sagacious, in fact, that he could not understand how so much wisdom on all points could be allied with madness. Was Faria deceived as to his treasure, or was all the world deceived as to Faria? Dantès remained in his cell all day, not daring to return to his friend, thinking thus to defer the moment when he should be convinced once for all that the abbé was mad. Such a conviction would be so terrible. But towards the evening, after the hour for the customary visit had gone by, Faria, not seeing the young man appear, tried to move and get over the distance which separated them. Edmond shuddered when he heard the painful efforts which the old man made to drag himself along. His leg was inert, and he could no longer make use of one arm. Edmond was obliged to assist him, for otherwise he would not have been able to enter by the small aperture which led to Dantès' chamber. "Here I am, pursuing you remorselessly," he said, with a benignant smile. "You thought to escape my munificence, but it is in vain. Listen to me." Edmond saw there was no escape, and placing the old man on his bed, he seated himself on the stool beside him. "You know," said the Abbé, "that I was the secretary and intimate friend of Cardinal Spada, the last of the princes of that name. I owe to this worthy lord all the happiness I ever knew. He was not rich, although the wealth of his family had passed into a proverb, and I heard the phrase very often, as rich as a Spada. But he, like public rumour, lived on this reputation for wealth. His palace was my paradise. I was tutor to his nephews, who are dead, and when he was alone in the world, I tried by absolute devotion to his will, to make up to him all he had done for me during 10 years of unremitting kindness. The cardinal's house had no secrets for me. I had often seen my noble patron annotating ancient volumes and eagerly searching amongst dusty family manuscripts. One day, when I was reproaching him for his unavailing searches, and deploring the prostration of mind that followed them, he looked at me and, smiling bitterly, opened a volume relating to the history of the city of Rome. There, in the 20th chapter of the life of Pope Alexander VI, were the following lines, which I can never forget. The great wars of Romagna had ended. Cæsar Borgia, who had completed his conquest, had need of money to purchase all Italy. The Pope had also need of money to bring matters to an end with Louis XII. King of France was formidable still in spite of his recent reverses, and it was necessary, therefore, to have recourse to some profitable scheme, which was a matter of great difficulty in the impoverished condition of exhausted Italy. His Holiness had an idea. He determined to make 2 cardinals. By choosing 2 of the greatest personages of Rome, especially rich men, this was the return the Holy Father looked for. In the first place, he could sell the great appointments and splendid offices which the cardinals already held, and then he had the 2 hats to sell besides. There was a third point in view, which will appear hereafter. The Pope and Cæsar Borgia first found the 2 future cardinals. They were Giovanni Rospigliosi, who held 4 of the highest dignities of the Holy See, and Cæsar Spada, one of the noblest and richest of the Roman nobility. Both felt the high honour of such a favour from the Pope. They were ambitious, and Cæsar Borgia soon found purchasers for their appointments. The result was that Rospigliosi and Spada paid for being cardinals, and 8 other persons paid for the offices the cardinals held before their elevation, and thus 800,000 crowns entered into the coffers of the speculators. It is time now to proceed to the last part of the speculation. The Pope heaped attentions upon Rospigliosi and Spada, conferred upon them the insignia of the cardinalate, and induced them to arrange their affairs and take up their residence at Rome. Then the Pope and Cæsar Borgia invited the 2 cardinals to dinner. This was a matter of dispute between the Holy Father and his son. Cæsar thought they could make use of one of the means which he always had ready for his friends, that is to say, in the first place, the famous key which was given to certain persons with the request that they go and open a designated cupboard. This key was furnished with a small iron point, a negligence on the part of the locksmith. When this was pressed to effect the opening of the cupboard, of which the lock was difficult, the person was pricked by this small point, and died next day. Then there was the rich king with the lion's head, which Cæsar wore when he wanted to greet his friends with a clasp of the hand. The lion bit the hand thus favoured, and at the end of 24 hours the bite was mortal. Cæsar proposed to his father that they should either ask the cardinals to open the cupboard, or shake hands with them. But Alexander VI replied, "Now as to the worthy cardinals, Spada and Rospigliosi, let us ask both of them to dinner. Something tells me that we shall get that money back. Besides, you forgot, Cæsar, an indigestion declares itself immediately, while a prick or a bite occasions a delay of a day or 2. Cæsar gave way before such cogent reasoning, and the cardinals were consequently invited to dinner. The table was laid in a vineyard belonging to the Pope, near San Pierdarena, a charming retreat which the cardinals knew very well by report. Rospigliosi, quite set up with his new dignities, went with a good appetite and his most ingratiating manner. Spada, a prudent man, and greatly attached to his only nephew, a young captain of the highest promise, took paper and pen, and made his will. He then sent word to his nephew to wait for him near the vineyard, but it appeared the servant did not find him. Spada knew what these invitations meant, since Christianity, so eminently civilizing, had made progress in Rome. It was no longer a centurion who came from the tyrant with a message, "Cæsar wills that you die," but it was a legate, a latere, who came with a smile on his lips to say from the Pope, "His Holiness requests you to dine with him." Spada set out about 2 o'clock to San Pierdarena. The Pope awaited him. The first sight that attracted the eyes of Spada was that of his nephew in full costume, and Cæsar Borgia paying him most marked attentions. Spada turned pale, as Cæsar looked at him with an ironical air, which proved that he had anticipated all, and that the snare was well spread. They began dinner, and Spada was only able to inquire of his nephew if he had received his message. The nephew replied no, perfectly comprehending the meaning of the question. It was too late, for he had already drunk a glass of excellent wine placed for him expressly by the Pope's butler. Spada at the same moment saw another bottle approach him which he was pressed to taste. An hour afterwards a physician declared they were both poisoned through eating mushrooms. Spada died on the threshold of the vineyard. The nephew expired at his own door, making signs which his wife could not comprehend. Then Cæsar and the Pope hastened to lay hands on the heritage under presence of seeking for the papers of the dead man. But the inheritance consisted in this only, a scrap of paper on which Spada had written, "I bequeath to my beloved nephew my coffers, my books, and amongst others, my breviary with the gold corners, which I beg he will preserve in remembrance of his affectionate uncle." The heir sought everywhere, admired the breviary, laid hands on the furniture, and were greatly astonished that Spada, the rich man, was really the most miserable of uncles. No treasures, unless they were those of science, contained in the library and laboratories. That was all. Cæsar and his father searched, examined, scrutinized, but found nothing, or at least very little, not exceeding a few thousand crowns in plate, and about the same in ready money, but the nephew had time to say to his wife before he expired, "Look well among my uncle's papers, there is a will." They sought even more thoroughly than the august heirs had done, but it was fruitless. There were 2 palaces and a vineyard behind the Palatine Hill, but in these days landed property had not much value, and the 2 palaces and the vineyard remained to the family, since they were beneath the rapacity of the Pope and his son. Months and years rolled on. Alexander VI died, poisoned, you know by what mistake. Cæsar, poisoned at the same time, escaped by shedding his skin like a snake, but the new skin was spotted by the poison till it looked like a tiger's. Then, compelled to quit Rome, he went and got himself obscurely killed in a night skirmish, scarcely noticed in history. After the Pope's death and his son's exile, it was supposed that the Spada family would resume the splendid position they had held before the cardinal's time, but this was not the case. The Spadas remained in doubtful ease, a mystery hung over this dark affair, and the public rumour was that Cæsar, a better politician than his father, had carried off from the Pope the fortune of the 2 cardinals. I say the 2, because Cardinal Rospigliosi, who had not taken any precaution, was completely despoiled. "Up to this," said Faria, interrupting the thread of his narrative, "this seems to you very meaningless, no doubt, eh?" "Oh, my friend," cried Dantès, "on the contrary, it seems as if I were reading a most interesting narrative. Go on, I beg of you." "I will. The family began to get accustomed to their obscurity. Years rolled on, and amongst the descendants some were soldiers, others diplomatists, some churchmen, some bankers, some grew rich, and some were ruined. I come now to the last of the family whose secretary I was, the Count of Spada. I had often heard him complain of the disproportion of his rank with his fortune, and I advised him to invest all he had in an annuity. He did so, and thus doubled his income. The celebrated breviary remained in the family, and was in the Count's possession. It had been handed down from father to son, for the singular clause of the only will that had been found had caused it to be regarded as a genuine relic, preserved in the family with superstitious veneration. It was an illuminated book, with beautiful Gothic characters, and so weighty with gold, that a servant always carried it before the cardinal on days of great solemnity. At the sight of papers of all sorts, titles, contracts, parchments, which were kept in the archives of the family, all descending from the poisoned cardinal, I in my turn examined the immense bundles of documents like 20 servitors, stewards, secretaries before me, but in spite of the most exhaustive researches I found nothing. Yet I had even written a precise history of the Borgia family, for the sole purpose of assuring myself whether any increase of fortune had occurred to them on the death of the Cardinal Cesar Spada, but could only trace the acquisition of the property of the Cardinal Rospigliosi, his companion in misfortune. I was then almost assured that the inheritance had neither profited the Borgias nor the family, but had remained unpossessed, like the treasures of the Arabian Nights, which slept in the bosom of the earth under the eyes of the genii. I searched, ransacked, counted, calculated 1,000 and 1,000 times the income and expenditure of the family for 300 years. It was useless. I remained in my ignorance, and the Count of Spada in his poverty. My patron died. He had reserved from his annuity his family papers, his library, composed of 5,000 volumes, and his famous breviary. All these he bequeathed to me, with 1,000 Roman crowns, which he had in ready money, on condition that I would have anniversary masses said for the repose of his soul, and that I would draw up a genealogical tree and history of his house. All this I did scrupulously. Be easy, my dear Edmond, we are near the conclusion. In 1807, a month before I was arrested, and a fortnight after the death of the Count of Spada, on the 25th of December, you will see presently how the date became fixed in my memory. I was reading for the 1,000th time the papers I was arranging, for the palace was sold to a stranger, and I was going to leave Rome and settle at Florence, intending to take with me 12,000 francs I possessed, my library, and the famous breviary, when, tired with my constant labour at the same thing, and overcome by a heavy dinner I had eaten, my head dropped on my hands, and I fell asleep about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I awoke as the clock was striking 6. I raised my head. I was in utter darkness. I rang for a light, but as no one came, I determined to find one for myself. It was indeed but anticipating the simple manners which I should soon be under the necessity of adopting. I took a wax candle in one hand, and with the other groped about for a piece of paper, my match-box being empty, with which I proposed to get a light from the small flame still playing on the embers. Fearing, however, to make use of any valuable piece of paper, I hesitated for a moment, then recollected that I had seen in the famous breviary, which was on the table beside me, an old paper, quite yellow with age, and which had served as a marker for centuries, kept there by the request of the heirs. I felt for it, found it, twisted it up together, and putting it on to the expiring flame, set light to it. But beneath my fingers, as if by magic, in proportion as the fire ascended, I saw yellowish characters appear on the paper. I grasped it in my hand, put out the flame as quickly as I could, lighted my taper in the fire itself, and opened the crumpled paper with inexpressible emotion, recognizing, when I had done so, that these characters had been traced in mysterious and sympathetic ink, only appearing when exposed to the fire. Nearly 1/3 of the paper had been consumed by the flame. It was that paper you read this morning. Read it again, Dantès, and then I will complete for you the incomplete words and unconnected sense." Faria, with an air of triumph, offered the paper to Dantès, who this time read the following words, traced with an ink of a reddish colour resembling rust: "This 25th day of April, 1498, B. Alexander VI, and fearing that not he may desire to become my heir, and and Bentivoglio, who were poisoned, my sole heir that I have bu, and has visited with me, that is in island of Monte Cristo, all I possess, jewels, diamonds, gems that I alone may amount to nearly 2 mil, will find on raising the 20th row, creek to the east in a right line, to open. In these caves the treasure is in the furthest A, which treasure I bequeath and leave N, as my sole heir. 25th April, 1498, says. "And now," said the Abbé, "read this other paper." And he presented to Dantès a second leaf with fragments of lines written on it, which Edmond read as follows: "Ing invited to dine by his Holiness, content with making me pay for my hat, serves for me the fate of Cardinals Caprara, I declare to my nephew Guido Spada. Read in a place he knows, the caves of the small. Est of ingots, gold, money? Know of the existence of this treasure, which lions of Roman crowns, and which he, ick from the small, ings have been made, Engel in the second, tire to him, R. Spada." Faria followed him with an excited look. "And now," he said, when he saw that Dantès had read the last line, "put the two fragments together, and judge for yourself." Dantès obeyed, and the conjointed pieces gave the following: "This 25th day of April, 1498, being invited to dine by his Holiness Alexandre VI, and fearing that not, content with making me pay for my hat, he may desire to become my heir, and reserves for me the fate of Cardinals Caprara and Bentivoglio, who were poisoned, I declare to my nephew Guido Spada, my sole heir, that I have buried in a place he knows and has visited with me, that is, in the caves of the small island of Monte Cristo, all I possessed of ingots, gold, money, jewels, diamonds, gems, that I alone know of the existence of this treasure, which may amount to nearly 2 millions of Roman crowns, and which he will find on raising the 20th rock from the small creek to the east in a right line. 2 openings have been made in these caves. The treasure is in the furthest angle in the second, which treasure I bequeath and leave entire to him as my sole heir. 25th April, 1498. Cesar Spada." "Well, do you comprehend now?" inquired Faria. "It is the declaration of Cardinal Spada, and the will so long sought for," replied Edmond, still incredulous. "Yes, 1,000 times, yes." "And who completed it as it now is?" "I did. Aided by the remaining fragment, I guessed the rest, measuring the length of the lines by those of the paper, and divining the hidden meaning by means of what was in part revealed, as we are guided in a cavern, by the small ray of light above us." "And what did you do when you arrived at this conclusion?" "I resolved to set out, and did set out at that very instant, carrying with me the beginning of my great work, the unity of the Italian kingdom. But for some time the imperial police, who at this period, quite contrary to what Napoleon desired so soon as he had a son born to him, wished for a partition of provinces, had their eyes on me and my hasty departure, the cause of which they were unable to guess, having aroused their suspicions. I was arrested at the very moment I was leaving Piombino." "Now," continued Faria, addressing Dantès with an almost paternal expression, "now, my dear fellow, you know as much as I do myself. If we ever escape together, half this treasure is yours. If I die here, and you escape alone, the whole belongs to you." "But," inquired Dantès, hesitating, "has this treasure no more legitimate possessor in the world than ourselves?" "No, no, be easy on that score. The family is extinct. The last Count of Spada, moreover, made me his heir, bequeathing to me this symbolic breviary. He bequeathed to me all it contained. No, no, make your mind satisfied on that point. If we lay hands on this fortune, we may enjoy it without remorse." "And you say this treasure amounts to—" "2 millions of Roman crowns, nearly 13 millions of our money. 2,600,000 in 1894. "Impossible!" said Dantès, staggered at the enormous amount. "Impossible! And why?" asked the old man. The Spada family was one of the oldest and most powerful families of the 15th century, and in those times, when other opportunities for investment were wanting, such accumulations of gold and jewels were by no means rare. There are at this day Roman families perishing of hunger, though possessed of nearly 1,000,000 in diamonds and jewels, handed down by entail, and which they cannot touch. Edmund thought he was in a dream. He wavered between incredulity and joy. "I have only kept this secret so long from you," continued Faria, "that I might test your character, and then surprise you. Had we escaped before my attack of catalepsy, I should have conducted you to Monte Cristo. Now," he added with a sigh, "it is you who will conduct me thither. Well, Dantès, you do not thank me?" "This treasure belongs to you, my dear friend," replied Dantès, "and to you only. I have no right to it. I am no relation of yours." "You are my son, Dantès!" exclaimed the old man. "You are the child of my captivity. My profession condemns me to celibacy. God has sent you to me to console, at one and the same time, the man who could not be a father, and the prisoner who could not get free." And Faria extended the arm, of which alone the use remained to him, to the young.
Faria really loved as a son, it had doubled its value in his eyes, and every day he expatiated on the amount, explaining to Dantès all the good which, with 13 or 14 millions of francs, a man could do in these days to his friends. And then Dantès' countenance became gloomy, for the oath of vengeance he had taken recurred to his memory, and he reflected how much ill in these times a man with 13 or 14 millions could do to his enemies. The abbé did not know the island of Monte Cristo, but Dantès knew it, and had often passed it, situated 25 miles from Pianosa, between Corsica and the island of Elba, and had once touched there. This island was, always had been, and still is, completely deserted. It is a rock of almost conical form, which looks as though it had been thrust up by volcanic force from the depth to the surface of the ocean. Dantès drew a plan of the island for Faria, and Faria gave Dantès advice as to the means he should employ to recover the treasure. But Dantès was far from being as enthusiastic and confident as the old man. It was past a question now that Faria was not a lunatic, and the way in which he had achieved the discovery, which had given rise to the suspicion of his madness, increased Edmond's admiration of him. But at the same time, Dantès could not believe that the deposit, supposing it had ever existed, still existed, and though he considered the treasure as by no means chimerical, he yet believed it was no longer there. However, as if fate resolved on depriving the prisoners of their last chance, and making them understand that they were condemned to perpetual imprisonment, a new misfortune befell them. The gallery on the sea-side, which had long been in ruins, was rebuilt. They had repaired it completely, and stopped up with vast masses of stone the hole Dantès had partly filled in. But for this precaution, which it will be remembered the abbé had made to Edmond, the misfortune would have been still greater, for their attempt to escape would have been detected, and they would undoubtedly have been separated. Thus a new, a stronger, and more inexorable barrier was interposed to cut off the realization of their hopes. "You see," said the young man, with an air of sorrowful resignation to Faria, "that God deems it right to take from me any claim to merit for what you call my devotion to you. I have promised to remain forever with you, and now I could not break my promise if I would. The treasure will be no more mine than yours, and neither of us will quit this prison. But my real treasure is not that, my dear friend, which awaits me beneath the sombre rocks of Monte Cristo. It is your presence, our living together 5 or 6 hours a day, in spite of our jailers. It is the rays of intelligence you have elicited from my brain, the languages you have implanted in my memory, and which have taken root there with all their philological ramifications. These different sciences that you have made so easy to me by the depth of the knowledge you possess of them, and the clearness of the principles to which you have reduced them. This is my treasure, my beloved friend, and with this you have made me rich and happy. Believe me, and take comfort. This is better for me than tons of gold and cases of diamonds, even were they not as problematical as the clouds we see in the morning floating over the sea, which we take for terra firma, and which evaporate and vanish as we draw near to them. to have you as long as possible near me, to hear your eloquent speech, which embellishes my mind, strengthens my soul, and makes my whole frame capable of great and terrible things. If I should ever be free, so fills my whole existence that the despair to which I was just on the point of yielding when I knew you has no longer any hold over me, and this my fortune, not chimerical but actual, I owe you my real good, my present happiness, and all the sovereigns of the earth, even Caesar Borgia himself, could not deprive me of this. Thus, if not actually happy, yet the days these two unfortunates passed together went quickly. Faria, who for so long a time had kept silence as to the treasure, now perpetually talked of it. As he had prophesied would be the case, he remained paralyzed in the right arm and the left leg, and had given up all hope of ever enjoying it himself. But he was continually thinking over some means of escape for his young companion, and anticipating the pleasure he would enjoy. For fear the letter might be some day lost or stolen, he compelled Dantès to learn it by heart, and Dantès knew it, from the first to the last word. Then he destroyed the second portion, assured that if the first were seized, no one would be able to discover its real meaning. Whole hours sometimes passed while Faria was giving instructions to Dantès, instructions which were to serve him when he was at liberty. Then, once free, from the day and hour and moment he was so, he could have but one only thought, which was, to gain Monte Cristo by some means, and remain there alone under some pretext which would arouse no suspicions, and once there, to endeavor to find the wonderful caverns, and search in the appointed spot, be it remembered, being the farthest angle in the second opening. In the meanwhile the hours passed, if not rapidly, at least tolerably. Faria, as we have said, without having recovered the use of his hand and foot, had regained all the clearness of his understanding, and had gradually, besides the moral instructions we have detailed, taught his youthful companion the patient and sublime duty of a prisoner, who learns to make something from nothing. They were thus perpetually employed, Faria, that he might not see himself grow old; Dantès, for fear of recalling the almost extinct past which now only floated in his memory like a distant light wandering in the night. So life went on for them as it does for those who are not victims of misfortune, and whose activities glide along mechanically and tranquilly beneath the eye of Providence. But beneath this superficial calm there were in the heart of the young man, and perhaps in that of the old man, many repressed desires, many stifled sighs, which found vent when Faria was left alone, and when Edmond returned to his cell. One night Edmond awoke suddenly, believing that he heard some one calling him. He opened his eyes upon utter darkness. His name, or rather a plaintive voice, which essayed to pronounce his name, reached him. He sat up in bed, and a cold sweat broke out upon his brow. Undoubtedly the call came from Faria's dungeon. "Alas," murmured Edmond, "can it be?" He moved his bed, drew up the stone, rushed into the passage, and reached the opposite extremity. The secret entrance was open. By the light of the wretched and wavering lamp, of which we have spoken, Dantès saw the old man, pale, but yet erect, clinging to the bedstead. His features were writhing with those horrible symptoms which he already knew, and which had so seriously alarmed him when he saw them for the first time. "Alas, my dear friend," said Faria, in a resigned tone, "you understand, do you not? And I need not attempt to explain to you." Edmond uttered a cry of agony, and quite out of his senses rushed towards the door, exclaiming, "Help! help!" Faria had just sufficient strength to restrain him. "Silence," he said, "or you are lost. We must now only think of you, my dear friend, and so act as to render your captivity supportable, or your flight possible. It would require years to do again what I have done here, and the results would be instantly destroyed if our jailers knew we had communicated with each other. Besides, be assured, my dear Edmond, the dungeon I am about to leave will not long remain empty. Some other unfortunate being will soon take my place, and to him you will appear like an angel of salvation. Perhaps he will be young, strong, and enduring like yourself, and will aid you in your escape, while I have been but a hindrance. You will no longer have half a dead body tied to you as a drag to all your movements. At length Providence has done something for you. He restores to you more than he takes away, and it was time I should die." Edmond could only clasp his hands and exclaim, "Oh, my friend, speak not thus!" And then resuming all his presence of mind, which had for a moment staggered under this blow, and his strength, which had failed at the words of the old man, he said, "Oh, I have saved you once, and I will save you a second time." And raising the foot of the bed, he drew out the phial, still a third filled with the red liquor. "See!" he exclaimed, "there remains still some of the magic draught. Quick, quick! Tell me what I must do this time. Are there fresh instructions? Speak, my friend, I listen." "There is not a hope," replied Faria, shaking his head. "But no matter. God wills it that man whom he has created, and in whose heart he has so profoundly rooted the love of life, should do all in his power to preserve that existence, which, however painful it may be, is yet always so dear." "Oh, yes, yes!" exclaimed Dantès, "and I tell you that I will save you yet." "Well, then, try. The cold gains upon me. I feel the blood flowing towards my brain. These horrible chills, which make my teeth chatter and seem to dislocate my bones, begin to pervade my whole frame. In 5 minutes the malady will reach its height, and in a quarter of an hour there will be nothing left of me but a corpse." "Oh!" exclaimed Dantès, his heart wrung with anguish. "Do as you did before, only do not wait so long. All the springs of life are now exhausted in me. And death," he continued, looking at his paralyzed arm and leg, "has but half its work to do. If, after having made me swallow 12 drops instead of 10, you see that I do not recover, then pour the rest down my throat. Now, lift me on my bed, for I can no longer support myself." Edmond took the old man in his arms and laid him on the bed. "And now, my dear friend," said Faria, "sole consolation of my wretched existence, you whom heaven gave me somewhat late, but still gave me, a priceless gift, and for which I am most grateful. At the moment of separating from you forever, I wish you all the happiness and all the prosperity you so well deserve. My son, I bless thee." The young man cast himself on his knees, leaning his head against the old man's bed. "Listen now to what I say in this my dying moment. The treasure of the Spadas exists. God grants me the boon of vision unrestricted by time or space. I see it in the depths of the inner cavern. My eyes pierce the inmost recesses of the earth and are dazzled at the sight of so much riches. If you do escape, remember that the poor abbé, whom all the world called mad, was not so. Hasten to Monte Cristo. Avail yourself of the fortune, for you have indeed suffered long enough." A violent convulsion attacked the old man. Dantès raised his head and saw Faria's eyes injected with blood. It seemed as if a flow of blood had ascended from the chest to the head. "Adieu, adieu," murmured the old man, clasping Edmond's hand convulsively. "Adieu!" "Oh, no, no, not yet!" he cried. "Do not forsake me! Oh, succor him! Help, help, help!" "Hush, hush," murmured the dying man, "that they may not separate us if you save me." "You are right. Oh, yes, yes, be assured I shall save you. Besides, although you suffer much, you do not seem to be in such agony as you were before." "Do not mistake. I suffer less, because there is in me less strength to endure. At your age, we have faith in life. It is the privilege of youth to believe and hope, but old men see death more clearly. Oh, 'tis here, 'tis here, 'tis over, my sight is gone, my senses fail. Your hand, Dantès! Adieu, adieu!" And raising himself by a final effort, in which he summoned all of his faculties, he said, "Monte Cristo! Forget not Monte Cristo!" and fell back on the bed. The crisis was terrible, and a rigid form with twisted limbs, swollen eyelids, and lips flecked with bloody foam lay on the bed of torture, in place of the intellectual being who so lately rested there. Dantès took the lamp, placed it on a projecting stone above the bed, whence its tremulous light fell with strange and fantastic ray on the distorted countenance and motionless, stiffened body. With steady gaze he awaited confidently the moment for administering the restorative. When he believed that the right moment had arrived, he took the knife, pried open the teeth, which offered less resistance than before, counted one after the other 12 drops, and watched. The phial contained perhaps twice as much more. He waited 10 minutes, a quarter of an hour, half an hour. No change took place. Trembling, his hair erect, his brow bathed with perspiration, he counted the seconds by the beating of his heart. Then he thought it was time to make the last trial, and he put the phial to the purple lips of Faria, and without having occasion to force open his jaws, which had remained extended, he poured the whole of the liquid down his throat. The draught produced a galvanic effect. A violent trembling pervaded the old man's limbs. His eyes opened until it was fearful to gaze upon them. He heaved a sigh which resembled a shriek, and then his convulsed body returned gradually to its former immobility, the eyes remaining open. Half an hour and a half elapsed, and during this period of anguish Edmond leaned over his friend, his hand applied to his heart, and felt the body gradually grow cold, and the heart's pulsation become more and more deep and dull, until at length it stopped. The last movement of the heart ceased. The face became livid. The eyes remained open, but the eyeballs were glazed. It was 6 o'clock in the morning. The dawn was just breaking, and its feeble ray came into the dungeon and paled the ineffectual light of the lamp. Strange shadows passed over the countenance of the dead man, and at times gave it the appearance of life. While the struggle between day and night lasted, Dantès still doubted, but as soon as the daylight gained the preeminence, he saw that he was alone with the corpse. Then an invincible and extreme terror seized upon him, and he dared not again press the hand that hung out of bed. He dared no longer to gaze on those fixed and vacant eyes, which he tried many times to close, but in vain. They opened again as soon as shut. He extinguished the lamp, carefully concealed it, and then went away, closing as well as he could the entrance to the secret passage by the large stone as he descended. It was time, for the jailer was coming. On this occasion he began his round at Dantès' cell, and on leaving him he went on to Faria's dungeon, taking thither breakfast and some linen. Nothing betokened that the man knew anything of what had occurred. He went on his way. Dantès was then seized with an indescribable desire to know what was going on in the dungeon of his unfortunate friend. He therefore returned by the subterraneous gallery, and arrived in time to hear the exclamations of the turnkey, who called out for help. Other turnkeys came, and then was heard the regular tramp of soldiers. Last of all came the governor. Edmond heard the creaking of the bed as they moved the corpse, heard the voice of the governor, who asked them to throw water on the dead man's face, and seeing that, in spite of this application, the prisoner did not recover, they sent for the doctor. The governor then went out, and words of pity fell on Dantès' listening ears, mingled with brutal laughter. "Well, well," said the one, "the madman has gone to look after his treasure. Good journey to him. With all his millions he will not have enough to pay for his shroud," said another. "Oh," added a third voice, "the shrouds of Chateau d'If are not dear." "Perhaps," said one of the previous speakers, "as he was a churchman, they may go to some expense on his behalf. They may give him the honors of the sack." Edmond did not lose a word, but comprehended very little of what was said. The voices soon ceased, and it seemed to him as if every one had left the cell. Still, he dared not to enter, as they might have left some turnkey to watch the dead. He remained, therefore, mute and motionless, hardly venturing to breathe. At the end of an hour he heard a faint noise, which increased. It was the governor who returned, followed by the doctor and other attendants. There was a moment's silence. It was evident that the doctor was examining the dead body. The inquiries soon commenced. The doctor analyzed the symptoms of the malady to which the prisoner had succumbed, and declared that he was dead. Questions and answers followed in a nonchalant manner that made Dantès indignant, for he felt that all the world should have for the poor abbé a love and respect equal to his own. "I am very sorry for what you tell me," said the governor, replying to the assurance of the doctor, "that the old man is really dead, for he was a quiet, inoffensive prisoner, happy in his folly, and required no watching." "Ah," added the turnkey, "there was no occasion for watching him. He would have stayed here 50 years, I'll answer for it, without any attempt to escape." "Still," said the governor, "I believe it would be requisite, notwithstanding your certainty, and not that I doubt your science, but in discharge of my official duty, that we should be perfectly assured that the prisoner is dead." There was a moment of complete silence, during which Dantès, still listening, knew that the doctor was examining the corpse a second time. "You may make your mind easy," said the doctor. "He is dead. I will answer for that." "You know, sir," said the governor, persisting, "that we are not content in such cases as this with such a simple examination. In spite of all appearances, be so kind, therefore, as to finish your duty by fulfilling the formalities described by law." "Let the irons be heated," said the doctor. "But really it is a useless precaution." This order to heat the irons made Dantès shudder. He heard hasty steps, the creaking of a door, people going and coming, and some minutes afterwards he entered, saying, "Here's a brazier, lighted." There was a moment's silence, and then was heard the crackling of burning flesh, of which the peculiar and nauseous smell penetrated even behind the wall where Dantès was listening in horror. The perspiration poured forth upon the young man's brow, and he felt as if he should faint. "You see, sir, he really is dead," said the doctor. "This burn in the heel is decisive. The poor fool is cured of his folly, and delivered from his captivity." "Wasn't his name Faria?" inquired one of the officers who accompanied the governor. "Yes, sir, and, as he said, it was an ancient name. He was, too, very learned, and rational enough on all points which did not relate to his treasure, but on that, indeed, he was intractable." "It is a sort of malady which we call monomania," said the doctor. "You never had anything to complain of?" said the governor to the jailer who had charge of the abbé. "Never, sir," replied the jailer. "Never. On the contrary, he sometimes amused me very much by telling me stories. One day, too, when my wife was ill, he gave me a prescription which cured her." "Ah, ah," said the doctor, "I did not know that I had a rival. But I hope, governor, that you will show him all proper respect." "Yes, yes, make your mind easy. He shall be decently interred in the newest sack we can find. Will that satisfy you?" "Must this last formality take place in your presence, sir?" inquired a turnkey. "Certainly, but make haste. I cannot stay here all day." Other footsteps, going and coming, were now heard, and a moment afterwards the noise of rustling canvas reached Dantès' ears. The bed creaked, and the heavy footfall of a man who lifts a weight sounded on the floor. Then the bed again creaked under the weight deposited upon it. "This evening," said the governor. "Will there be any mass?" asked one of the attendants. "That is impossible," replied the governor. "The chaplain of the château came to me yesterday to beg for leave of absence, in order to take a trip to Jerez for a week. I told him I would attend to the prisoners in his absence. If the poor abbé had not been in such a hurry, he might have had his requiem." "Pooh, pooh," said the doctor, with the impiety usual in persons of his profession. "He is a churchman. God will respect his profession, and not give the devil the wicked delight of sending him to a priest." A shout of laughter followed this brutal jest. Meanwhile the operation of putting the body in the sack was going on. "This evening," said the governor, when the task was ended. "At what hour?" inquired the turnkey. "Why, about 10 or 11 o'clock." "Shall we watch by the corpse?" "Of what use would it be? Shut the dungeon as if he were alive, that is all." Then the steps retreated, and the voices died away in the distance. The noise of the door, with its creaking hinges and bolts, ceased, and a silence more sombre than that of solitude ensued, the silence of death, which was all-pervasive and struck its icy chill to the very soul of Dantès. Then he raised the flagstone cautiously with his head, and looked carefully.
The cemetery of Château-d'If. On the bed, at full length and faintly illuminated by the pale light that came from the window, lay a sack of canvas, and under its rude folds was stretched a long and stiffened form. It was Faria's last winding-sheet, a winding-sheet which, as the turnkey said, cost so little. Everything was in readiness. A barrier had been placed between Dantès and his old friend. No longer could Edmond look into those wide-opened eyes which had seemed to be penetrating the mysteries of death. No longer could he clasp the hand which had done so much to make his existence blessed. Faria, the beneficent and cheerful companion, with whom he was accustomed to live so intimately, no longer breathed. He seated himself on the edge of that terrible bed, and fell into melancholy and gloomy reverie. Alone! He was alone again! Again condemned to silence!
again face to face with nothingness. Alone! Never again to see the face, never again to hear the voice of the only human being who united him to earth. Was not Faria's fate the better, after all, to solve the problem of life at its source, even at the risk of horrible suffering? The idea of suicide, which his friend had driven away and kept away by his cheerful presence, now hovered like a phantom over the abbé's dead body. "If I could die," he said, "I should go where he goes, and should assuredly find him again. But how to die? It is very easy," he went on with a smile. "I will remain here, rush on the first person that opens the door, strangle him, and then they will guillotine me." But excessive grief is like a storm at sea, where the frail bark is tossed from the depths to the top of the wave. Dantès recoiled from the idea of so infamous a death, and passed suddenly from despair to an ardent desire for life and liberty. "Die? Oh no!" he exclaimed. "Not die now, after having lived and suffered so long and so much.
Die? Yes, had I died years ago.
But now to die would be, indeed, to give way to the sarcasm of destiny. No, I want to live. I shall struggle to the very last. I will yet win back the happiness of which I have been deprived. Before I die, I must not forget that I have my executioners to punish, and perhaps, too, who knows, some friends to reward. Yet they will forget me here, and I shall die in my dungeon like Faria." As he said this, he became silent and gazed straight before him like one overwhelmed with a strange and amazing thought. Suddenly he arose, lifted his hand to his brow as if his brain were giddy, paced twice or thrice round the dungeon, and then paused abruptly by the bed. "Just God!" he muttered. "Whence comes this thought? Is it from thee? Since none but the dead pass freely from this dungeon, let me take the place of the dead." Without giving himself time to reconsider his decision, and indeed that he might not allow his thoughts to be distracted from his desperate resolution, he bent over the appalling shroud, opened it with the knife which Faria had made, drew the corpse from the sack, and bore it along the tunnel to his own chamber, laid it on his couch, tied around its head the rag he wore at night around his own, covered it with his counterpane, once again kissed the ice-cold brow, and tried vainly to close the resisting eyes, which glared horribly, turned the head towards the wall so that the jailer might, when he brought the evening meal, believe that he was asleep, as was his frequent custom. Entered the tunnel again, drew the bed against the wall, returned to the other cell, took from the hiding-place the needle and thread, flung off his rags that they might feel only naked flesh beneath the coarse canvas, and, getting inside the sack, placed himself in the posture in which the dead body had been laid, and sewed up the mouth of the sack from the inside. He would have been discovered by the beating of his heart, if by any mischance the jailers had entered at that moment. Dantès might have waited until the evening visit was over, but he was afraid that the governor would change his mind, and order the dead body to be removed earlier. In that case, his last hope would have been destroyed. Now his plans were fully made, and this is what he intended to do. If, while he was being carried out, the gravediggers should discover that they were bearing a live instead of a dead body, Dantès did not intend to give them time to recognize him, but with a sudden cut of the knife he meant to open the sack from top to bottom, and, profiting by their alarm, escape. If they tried to catch him, he would use his knife to better purpose. If they took him to the cemetery and laid him in a grave, he would allow himself to be covered with earth, and then, as it was night, the gravediggers could scarcely have turned their backs before he would have worked his way through the yielding soil and escaped. He hoped that the weight of the earth would not be so great that he could not overcome it. If he was detected in this and the earth proved too heavy, he would be stifled, and then, so much the better, all would be over. Dantès had not eaten since the preceding evening, but he had not thought of hunger, nor did he think of it now. His situation was too precarious to allow him even time to reflect on any thought but one. The first risk that Dantès ran was, that the jailer, when he brought him his supper at 7 o'clock, might perceive the change that had been made. Fortunately, 20 times at least, from misanthropy or fatigue, Dantès had received his jailer in bed, and then the man placed his bread and soup on the table, and went away without saying a word. This time the jailer might not be as silent as usual, but speak to Dantès, and seeing that he received no reply, go to the bed, and thus discover all. When 7 o'clock came, Dantès' agony really began. His hand, placed upon his heart, was unable to redress its throbbings, while with the other he wiped the perspiration from his temples. From time to time, chills ran through his whole body and clutched his heart in a grasp of ice. Then he thought he was going to die. Yet the hours passed on without any unusual disturbance, and Dantès knew that he had escaped the first peril. It was a good augury. At length, about the hour the governor had appointed, footsteps were heard on the stairs. Edmond felt that the moment had arrived, summoned up all his courage, held his breath, and would have been happy if at the same time he could have repressed the throbbing in his veins. The footsteps, they were double, paused at the door, and Dantès guessed that the 2 gravediggers had come to seek him. This idea was soon converted into certainty when he heard the noise they made in putting down the hand-bier. The door opened, and a dim light reached Dantès' eyes through the coarse sack that covered him. He saw 2 shadows approach his bed, a third remaining at the door with the torch in its hand. The 2 men, approaching the ends of the bed, took the sack by its extremities. "He's heavy, though, for an old man," said one as he raised the head. "They say every year adds half a pound to the weight of bones," added another, lifting the feet. "Have you tied the knot?" inquired the first speaker. "What would be the use of carrying so much more weight?" was the reply. "I can do that when we get there." "Yes, you're right," replied the companion. "What's the knot for?" thought Dantès. They deposited the supposed corpse on the bier. Edmond stiffened himself in order to play the part of a dead man, and then the party, lighted by the man with the torch who went first, ascended the stairs. Suddenly he felt the fresh and sharp night air, and Dantès knew that the mistral was blowing. It was a sensation in which pleasure and pain were strangely mingled. The bearers went on for 20 paces, then stopped, putting the bier down on the ground. One of them went away, and Dantès heard his shoes striking on the pavement. "Where am I?" he asked himself. "Really, he is by no means a light load," said the other bearer, sitting on the edge of the hand-barrow. Dantès' first impulse was to escape, but fortunately he did not attempt it. "Give us a light," said the other bearer, "or I shall never find what I am looking for." The man with the torch complied, although not asked in the most polite terms. "What can he be looking for?" thought Edmond. "The spade, perhaps." An exclamation of satisfaction indicated that the gravedigger had found the object of his search. "Here it is at last," he said. "Not without some trouble, though." "Yes," was the answer, "but it has lost nothing by waiting." As he said this, the man came towards Edmond, who heard a heavy metallic substance laid down beside him, and at the same moment a cord was fastened round his feet with sudden and painful violence. "Well, have you tied the knot?" inquired the gravedigger, who was looking on. "Yes, and pretty tight too, I can tell you," was the answer. "Move on, then," and the bier was lifted once more, and they proceeded. They advanced 50 paces farther, and then stopped to open a door, then went forward again. The noise of the waves dashing against the rocks on which the chateau was built reached Dantès' ear distinctly as they went forward. "Bad weather," observed one of the bearers. "Not a pleasant night for a dip in the sea." "Why, yes, the abbey runs a chance of being wet," said the other. And then there was a burst of brutal laughter. Dantès did not comprehend the jest, but his hair stood erect on his head. "Well, here we are at last," said one of them. "A little farther, a little farther," said the other. You know very well that the last was stopped on his way, dashed on the rocks, and the governor told us next day that we were careless fellows." They ascended 5 or 6 more steps, and then Dantès felt that they took him, one by the head and the other by the heels, and swung him to and fro. "1," said the gravers, "2, 3." At the same instant Dantès felt himself flung into the air like a wounded bird, falling with a rapidity that made his blood curdle. Although drawn downwards by the heavy weight which hastened his rapid descent, it seemed to him as if the fall lasted for a century. At last, with a horrible splash, he darted like an arrow into the ice-cold water, and as he had presence of mind to hold his breath, and as his right hand, prepared as he was for every chance, held his knife open, he rapidly ripped up the sack, extricated his arm and then his body. But in spite of all his efforts to free himself from the shot, he felt it dragging him down still lower. He then bent his body, and by a desperate effort severed the cord that bound his legs, at the moment when it seemed as if he were actually strangled. With a mighty leap he rose to the surface of the sea, while the shot dragged down to the depths the sack that had so nearly become his shroud. Dantès waited only to get breath, and then dived in order to avoid being seen. When he arose a second time, he was 50 paces from where he had first sunk. He saw overhead a black and tempestuous sky, across which the wind was driving clouds that occasionally suffered a twinkling star to appear. Before him was the vast expanse of waters, somber and terrible, whose waves foamed and roared as if before the approach of a storm. Behind him, blacker than the sea, blacker than the sky, rose, phantom-like, the vast stone structure, whose projecting crags seemed like arms extended to seize their prey, and on the highest rock was a torch lighting 2 figures. He fancied that these 2 forms were looking at the sea. Doubtless these strange grave-diggers had heard his cry. Dantès dived again, and remained a long time beneath the water. This was an easy feat to him, for he usually attracted a crowd of spectators in the bay before the lighthouse at Marseilles when he swam there, and was unanimously declared to be the best swimmer in the port. When he came up again the light had disappeared. He must now get his bearings. Ratonneau and Pomègue are the nearest islands of all those that surround the Château d'If, but Ratonneau and Pomègue are inhabited, as is also the islet of Daume. Tiboulin and Le Maire were therefore the safest for Dantès' adventure. The island of Tiboulin and Le Maire are a league from the Château d'If. Dantès, nevertheless, determined to make for them. But how could he find his way in the darkness of the night? At this moment he saw the light of Planier, gleaming in front of him like a star. By leaving this light on the right, he kept the island of Tiboulin a little on the left. By turning to the left, therefore, he would find it. But, as we have said, it was at least a league from the Château d'If to this island. Often in prison Faria had said to him, when he saw him idle and inactive, "Dantès, you must not give way to this listlessness. You will be drowned if you seek to escape, and your strength has not been properly exercised and prepared for exertion." These words rang in Dantès' ears, even beneath the waves. He hastened to cleave his way through them, to see if he had not lost his strength. He found with pleasure that his captivity had taken away nothing of his power, and he was still master of that element on whose bosom he had so often sported as a boy. Fear, that relentless pursuer, clogged Dantès' efforts. He listened for any sound that might be audible, and every time that he rose to the top of a wave he scanned the horizon and strove to penetrate the darkness. He fancied that every wave behind him was a pursuing boat, and he redoubled his exertions, increasing rapidly his distance from the chateau, but exhausting his strength. He swam on still, and already the terrible chateau had disappeared in the darkness. He could not see it, but he felt its presence. An hour passed, during which Dantès, excited by the feeling of freedom, continued to cleave the waves. "Let us see," said he. "I have swum about an hour, but as the wind is against me, that has retarded my speed. However, if I am not mistaken, I must be close to Tiboulen. But what if I were mistaken?" A shudder passed over him. He sought to tread water in order to rest himself, but the sea was too violent, and he felt that he could not make use of this means of recuperation. "Well," said he, "I will swim on until I am worn out, or the cramp seizes me, and then I shall sink." And he struck out with energy or despair. Suddenly the sky seemed to him to become still darker and more dense, and heavy clouds seemed to sweep down towards him. At the same time he felt a sharp pain in his knee. He fancied for a moment that he had been shot, and listened for the report, but he heard nothing. Then he put out his hand and encountered an obstacle, and with another stroke knew that he had gained the shore. Before him rose a grotesque mass of rocks that resembled nothing so much as a vast fire petrified at the moment of its most fervent combustion. It was the island of Tiboulen. Dantès rose, advanced a few steps, and with a fervent prayer of gratitude stretched himself on the granite, which seemed to him softer than down. Then, in spite of the wind and rain, he fell into the deep, sweet sleep of utter exhaustion. At the expiration of an hour, Edmond was awakened by the roar of thunder. The tempest was let loose and beating the atmosphere with its mighty wings. From time to time a flash of lightning stretched across the heavens like a fiery serpent, lighting up the clouds that rolled on in vast chaotic waves. Dantès had not been deceived. He had reached the first of the two islands, which was, in fact, Tiboulen. He knew that it was barren and without shelter, but when the sea became more calm, he resolved to plunge into its waves again, and swim to La Mer, equally arid but larger, and consequently better adapted for concealment. An overhanging rock offered him a temporary shelter, and scarcely had he availed himself of it, when the tempest burst forth in all its fury. Edmond felt the trembling of the rock beneath which he lay. The waves, dashing themselves against it, wetted him with their spray. He was safely sheltered, and yet he felt dizzy in the midst of the warring of the elements and the dazzling brightness of the lightning. It seemed to him that the island trembled to its base, and that it would, like a vessel at anchor, break moorings and bear him off into the center of the storm. He then recollected that he had not eaten or drunk for 24 hours. He extended his hands and drank greedily of the rainwater that had lodged in a hollow of the rock. As he rose, a flash of lightning, that seemed to rive the remotest heights of heaven, illumined the darkness. By its light, between the island of La Mer and Cape Croiselle, a quarter of a league distant, Dantès saw a fishing boat driven rapidly like a spectre before the power of winds and waves. A second after, he saw it again, approaching with frightful rapidity. Dantès cried at the top of his voice to warn them of their danger, but they saw it themselves. Another flash showed him 4 men clinging to the shattered mast and the rigging, while a 5th clung to the broken rudder. The men he beheld saw him undoubtedly, for their cries were carried to his ears by the wind. Above the splintered mast, a sail, rent to tatters, was waving. Suddenly the ropes that still held it gave way, and it disappeared in the darkness of the night like a vast sea-bird. At the same moment a violent crash was heard and cries of distress. Dantès from his rocky perch saw the shattered vessel, and among the fragments the floating forms of the hapless sailors. Then all was dark again. Dantès ran down the rocks at the risk of being himself dashed to pieces. He listened, he groped about, but he heard and saw nothing. The cries had ceased and the tempest continued to rage. By degrees the wind abated. Vast gray clouds rolled towards the west, and the blue firmament appeared studded with bright stars. Soon a red streak became visible in the horizon. The waves whitened, a light played over them, and gilded their foaming crests with gold. It was day. Dantès stood mute and motionless before this majestic spectacle, as if he now beheld it for the first time. And indeed, since his captivity in the Château d'If, he had forgotten that such scenes were ever to be witnessed. He turned toward the fortress, and looked at both sea and land. The gloomy building rose from the bosom of the ocean, with imposing majesty, and seemed to dominate the scene. It was about 5 o'clock. The sea continued to get calmer. "In 2 or 3 hours," thought Dantès, "the turnkey will enter my chamber, find the body of my poor friend, recognize it, seek for me in vain, and give the alarm. Then the tunnel will be discovered. The men who cast me into the sea, and who must have heard the cry I uttered, will be questioned. The boats filled with armed soldiers will pursue the wretched fugitive. The cannon will warn everyone to refuse shelter to a man wandering about naked and famished. The police of Marseilles will be on the alert by land, whilst the governor pursues me by sea. I am cold, I am hungry, I have lost even the knife that saved me. Oh, my God, I have suffered enough, surely. Have pity on me, and do for me what I am unable to do for myself." As Dantès, his eyes turned in the direction of the Château d'If, uttered this prayer, he saw off the farther point of the island of Pomègue a small vessel with lateen sail skimming the sea like a gull in search of prey, and with his sailor's eye he knew it to be a Genoese tartan. She was coming out of Marseilles harbor and was standing out to sea rapidly, her sharp prow cleaving through the waves. "Oh," cried Edmond, "to think that in half an hour I could join her, did I not fear being questioned, detected, and conveyed back to Marseilles! What can I do? What story can I invent? Under pretext of trading along the coast, these men, who are in reality smugglers, will prefer selling me to doing a good action. I must wait, but I cannot. I am starving. In a few hours my strength will be utterly exhausted. Besides, perhaps I have not been missed at the fortress. I can pass as one of the sailors wrecked last night. My story will be accepted, for there is no one left to contradict me." As he spoke, Dantès looked toward the spot where the fishing vessel had been wrecked, and started. The red cap of one of the sailors hung to a point of the rock, and some timbers that had formed part of the vessel's keel floated at the foot of the crag. In an instant Dantès' plan was formed. He swam to the cap, placed it on his head, seized one of the timbers, and struck out so as to cut across the course the vessel was taking. "I am saved," murmured he, and this conviction restored his strength. He soon saw that the vessel, with the wind dead ahead, was tacking between the Château d'If and the tower of Planier. For an instant he feared lest, instead of keeping in shore, she should stand out to sea, but he soon saw that she would pass, like most vessels bound for Italy, between the islands of Jaros and Casalegagnes. However, the vessel and the swimmer insensibly neared one another, and in one of its tacks the tartan bore down with 1/4 of a mile of him. He rose on the waves, making signs of distress, but no one on board saw him, and the vessel stood on another tack. Dantès would have shouted, but he knew that the wind would drown his voice. It was then he rejoined at his precaution in taking the timber, for without it he would have been unable, perhaps, to reach the vessel, certainly to return to shore, should he be unsuccessful in attracting attention. Dantès, although sure as to what course the vessel would take, had yet watched it anxiously until it tacked and stood towards him. Then he advanced, but before they could meet, the vessel again changed her course. By a violent effort he rose half out of the water, waving his cap and uttering a loud shout peculiar to sailors. This time he was both seen and heard, and the tartan instantly steered towards him. At the same time he saw they were about to lower the boat. An instant after, the boat, rowed by 2 men, advanced rapidly towards him. Dantès let go of the timber, which he now thought to be useless, and swam vigorously to meet them. But he had reckoned too much upon his strength, and then he realized how serviceable the timber had been to him. His arms became stiff, his legs lost their flexibility, and he was almost breathless. He shouted again. The 2 sailors redoubled their efforts, and one of them cried in Italian, "Courage!" The word reached his ear as a wave which he no longer had the strength to surmount passed over his head. He rose again to the surface, struggled with the last desperate effort of a drowning man, uttered a third cry, and felt himself sinking, as if the fatal cannon shot were again tied to his feet. The water passed over his head, and the sky turned grey. A convulsive movement again brought him to the surface. He felt himself seized by the hair. Then he saw and heard nothing. He had fainted. When he opened his eyes, Dantès found himself on the deck of the tartan. His first care was to see what course they were taking. They were rapidly leaving the Chateau d'If behind. Dantès was so exhausted that the exclamation of joy he uttered was mistaken for a sigh. As we have said, he was lying on the deck. A sailor was rubbing his limbs with a woolen cloth. Another, whom he recognized as the one who had cried out "Courage!" held a gourd full of rum to his mouth; while the third, an old sailor, at once the pilot and captain, looked on with that egotistical pity men feel for a misfortune that they have escaped yesterday, and which may overtake them tomorrow. A few drops of the rum restored suspended animation, while the friction of his limbs restored their elasticity. "Who are you?" said the pilot in bad French. "I am," replied Dantès in bad Italian, "a Maltese sailor. We were coming from Syracuse laden with grain. The storm of last night overtook us at Cape Morgian, and we were wrecked on these rocks." "Where do you come from?" "From these rocks that I had the good luck to cling to while our captain and the rest of the crew were all lost. I saw your vessel, and fearful of being left to perish on the desolate island, I swam off on a piece of wreckage to try and intercept your course. You have saved my life, and I thank you," continued Dantès. "I was lost when one of your sailors caught hold of my hair." "It was I," said a sailor of a frank and manly appearance, "and it was time, for you were sinking." "Yes," returned Dantès, holding out his hand, "I thank you again." "I almost hesitated, though," replied the sailor. "You looked more like a brigand than an honest man, with your beard 6 inches and your hair a foot long." Dantès recollected that his hair and beard had not been cut all the time he was at the Chateau d'If. "Yes," said he, "I made a vow to Our Lady of the Grotto not to cut my hair or beard for 10 years if I were saved in a moment of danger; but today the vow expires." "Now, what are we to do with you?" said the captain. "Alas! anything, if you please. My captain is dead. I have barely escaped, but I am a good sailor. Leave me at the first port you make. I shall be sure to find employment." "Do you know the Mediterranean?" "I have sailed it over since my childhood." "You know the best harbors?" "There are few ports that I could not enter or leave with a bandage over my eyes." "I say, captain," said the sailor who had cried courage to Dantès, "if what he says is true, what hinders his staying with us?" "If he says true," said the captain doubtingly, "but in his present condition he will promise anything, and take his chance of keeping it afterwards." "I will do more than promise," said Dantès. "We shall see," returned the other, smiling. "Where are you going?" asked Dantès. "To Leghorn." "Then why, instead of tacking so frequently, do you not sail nearer the wind?" "Because we should run straight on to the island of Rayon." "You shall pass by it by 20 fathoms." "Take the helm, and let us see what you know." The young man took the helm, felt to see if the vessel answered the rudder promptly, and seeing that, without being a first-rate sailor, she yet was tolerably obedient. "To the sheets," said he. The 4 seamen who composed the crew obeyed, while the pilot looked on. "Haul taut." They obeyed. "Belay." This order was also executed, and the vessel passed, as Dantès had predicted, 20 fathoms to windward. "Bravo! bravo!" said the captain. "Bravo!" repeated the sailors, and they all looked with astonishment at this man whose eye now disclosed an intelligence, and his body a vigor they had not thought him capable of showing. "You see," said Dantès, quitting the helm, "I shall be of some use to you, at least during the voyage. If you do not want me at Leghorn, you can leave me there, and I will pay you out of the first wages I get for my food and the clothes you lend me." "Ah," said the captain, "we can agree very well if you are reasonable." "Give me what you give the others, and it will be all right," returned Dantès. "That's not fair," said the seaman who had saved Dantès, "for you know more than we do." "What is that to you, Jacopo?" returned the captain. "Every one is free to ask what he pleases." "That's true," replied Jacopo. "I only make a remark. Well, you would do much better to find him a jacket and a pair of trousers, if you have them." "No," said Jacopo, "but I have a shirt and a pair of trousers." "That is all I want," interrupted Dantès. Jacopo dived into the hold and soon returned with what Edmond wanted. "Now then, do you wish for anything else?" said the patron. "A piece of bread and another glass of the capital rum I tasted, for I have not eaten or drunk for a very long time." He had not tasted food for 40 hours. A piece of bread was brought, and Jacopo offered him the gourd. "Larboard your helm!" cried the captain to the steersman. Dantès glanced that way as he lifted the gourd to his mouth, then paused with his hand in mid-air. "Hollo! What's the matter at Chateau d'If?" said the captain. A small white cloud, which had attracted Dantès' attention, crowned the summit of the bastion of the Chateau d'If. At the same moment the faint report of a gun was heard. The sailors looked at one another. "What is this?" asked the captain. "A prisoner has escaped from the Chateau d'If, and they are firing the alarm gun," replied Dantès. The captain glanced at him, but he had lifted the rum to his lips and was drinking it with so much composure that suspicions, if the captain had any, died away. "At any rate," murmured he, "if it be, so much the better, for I have made a rare acquisition." Under pretense of being fatigued, Dantès asked to take the helm. The steersman, glad to be relieved, looked at the captain, and the latter by a sign indicated that he might abandon it to his new comrade. Dantès could thus keep his eye on Marseilles. "What is the day of the month?" he asked Jacopo, who sat down beside him. "The 28th of February." "In what year?" "In what year? You ask me in what year?" "Yes," replied the young man, "I ask you in what year." "You have forgotten, then?" "I got such a fright last night," replied Dantès, smiling, "that I have almost lost my memory. I ask you, what year is it?" "The year 1829," returned Jacopo. It was 14 years, day for day, since Dantès' arrest. He was 19 when he entered the Chateau d'If. He was 33 when he escaped. A sorrowful smile passed over his face. He asked himself what had become of Mercédès, who must believe him dead. Then his eyes lighted up with hatred as he thought of the 3 men who had caused him so long and wretched a captivity. He renewed against Danglars, Fernand, and Villefort the oath of implacable vengeance he had made in his dungeon. This oath was no longer a vain menace, for the fastest sailor in the Mediterranean would have been unable to overtake the